Now, over the years, I've written a lot about warfare in the ancient world, obviously, particularly the Roman period. I started very much as a Romanist, looking at the Roman army and trying to understand how it functioned. I've written about the great conflicts, the Punic Wars, those titanic struggles, particularly the First and Second Punic War, that involved years and years of conflict, many major battles and huge loss of life and wider destruction, and eventually culminated in the much shorter Third Punic War that extinguished Carthage as a political entity. So big wars are important, and the major battles are dramatic episodes within those conflicts, and there's something we tend to focus on. You know, if people talk about Alexander the Great at war, they tend to think of Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and Hydaspes. They're less likely to think, at least first, of the many sieges that occupied so much of his time, but also of the lower level marching, campaigning, surprise attacks, reprisals that occupied him for much of his short life. Alexander did spend a lot of his time at war, but he only fought those 4 major battles during his reign, and if you include Chaeronea, you could say he only really participated in 5 major battles in his entire life. And again, even when we look at the most intensive periods of fighting in the Second Punic War, it was rare to have more than 1 battle a year, certainly within the same theatre, and there were some years without an encounter on that scale, and that was one of the most intensive. If you go through Julius Caesar's narratives of his campaigns in Gaul, then you'll see the big battles, and sometimes more than one of them in a campaigning season, particularly at the beginning in 58 BC. But you'll also see sieges, and you'll see a lot more smaller scale activity. And the raid, which is perhaps the epitome of this, is what we're going to talk about and discuss today. Now, by raid, I'm using the term fairly broadly. We're looking at the occasions when somebody decided to attack Roman territory, or the Romans decided to advance beyond their controlled area and move beyond the frontiers and attack somebody else, whether to dominate, to intimidate, or as a reprisal, a reaction to earlier attacks. And there is a pattern that you see in Roman foreign relations from very early on, whereby Roman wars are explained as a response to attacks on Roman citizens, Roman territory, or Rome's allies. Rome's allies become the most common pretext for war. Attacks upon them lead to the Romans saying, well, if we're going to be an effective ally, we need to show them that we will protect our friends and therefore punish the people who have attacked them. Now, much of this warfare is not about major battles, though some quite significantly sized actions will occur in some occasions during the course of a raid or in a response to a raid, depending on its size. The objective is usually to take something, to achieve something. Very often these are physical rewards. They're plunder, they're booty, they are livestock, human captives, or they might be more symbolic trophies for some of the tribal peoples. Headhunting is very important, and taking the severed heads of your enemies offers proof of your status, your courage, your bravery as a warrior, and for the leaders of those groups of warriors, their particular status as someone who brings victory, who brings success. So these can be important symbols and useful things within your society and within the politics of your society to show that you are someone who matters, whose leadership needs to be acknowledged, whose word needs to be taken seriously, someone who can compete with other similar war leaders, but also not just within your tribe, but those beyond. So we're going to be talking about that sort of warfare. So it can be as a reprisal. It can also be the perception that the Romans are too strong to confront in open battle. Therefore, we will raid them. We will ambush small detachments or destroy small outposts. And more importantly, we will pick on the vulnerable. We will plunder them. We will steal their cattle, their sheep. We will steal their people, or we will kill them, or we will burn their settlements, as a sign that we are people to be feared and taken seriously. But it can be a type of warfare to which people resort when they're not willing to risk a major battle with the Roman army, or that they actually think, well, if we've got the number of people to do it, but we don't want to risk it because we know the Romans are good at that sort of fighting. Conversely, the Romans can adopt the same attitude. They will sometimes choose to raid when it isn't in their interest or within their capacity at the moment to fight a major battle. So raiding is something that is very frequent, and we're going to extend it because we'll need to look at as much evidence as we can possibly get. So we're going to look at large-scale banditry as well. And some of the discussions of piracy and incidents of that tell you something about how these things were arranged, how they were done, what people were trying to do and how they tried to do it on both sides. So whether you are the attacker, the raider going out there for your plunder, for your glory, to make the enemy pay or suffer or to humiliate them, whatever the purpose might be, or whether you are the defender who is faced with this problem, that people are coming into your territory and attacking you where you are weak, where you least expect it. How do you respond to this? How do you try to control this sort of fighting? One constant theme in the history of Roman frontier relations, both from the Roman perspective but also from other peoples out there, is that if you have a few small attacks and a few plundering raids that come in and are successful and go home, then the odds are that more will come and they will get larger and more frequent. So that if you don't deal with this sort of low-level fighting, then often you will move to more of it, greater intensity, and eventually perhaps to large-scale invasion. We're not primarily talking today about campaigns that are meant to occupy permanently any of the targets of these attacks. So it isn't about invasion and conquest. It's about go in, hit the enemy, achieve what you want, and get home again. So as I say, raiding, banditry, piracy, and we'll look at it from both sides, whether the Romans are the defenders being attacked or their allies are people being attacked, or whether they sometimes are launching reprisal raids or preemptive raids in their own right. Because each will show us something about the mechanisms involved, just people how they try to do this and how it actually works. Because one big problem with the ancient world is that people often talk about things, they talk about battles, they talk about wars, they talk about political rivalries, without thinking in detail, in practical terms, just how did these things work out? How were they carried out? How were they conducted? What did people have to do? On what scale did they occur? Both time scale, both geographical scale, and in terms of the number of people involved and the sort of cost involved to winners and losers in these sorts of things. So this is very much a talk about how these things were done. And to do that, we need to look at a very wide range of evidence from the ancient sources, backed up by archaeology, but also some parallels from other periods and an element of common sense where we're trying to think about, okay, how would you actually do this? And what does it mean? So that hopefully this is a useful framework of thinking about one of the most frequent types of warfare in the ancient world, but one that is not systematically studied by scholars. We tend to ignore it. We tend to think occasionally about it when we're looking at Roman frontier systems, but also it's of relevance to those studying Iron Age societies before the Romans arrive. So you have questions about when you look at, say, a hill fort, one of the big ones like Maiden Castle or Hambledon Hill in Britain, as to whether or not these were intended as serious defensive and protected places. Whether they were somewhere you lived or whether they were somewhere where you ran to, fled to, and sought refuge in the case of raiding, then that's another matter. But if we're going to understand that, people often jump to conclusions and will tend to say, well, this isn't defensive because, look, they've built this hill fort, but actually just next to it there's a hill that's even higher. Now that might be thinking in too modern terms, because that's only really relevant if anyone likely to attack has missile weapons capable of reaching from that higher ground into your fortified place, into your hill fort. And in most cases in the ancient world that's not true. You don't have even early modern artillery, and most armies don't even have the Taurtian artillery that is available to the Macedonians and the Romans and the more organized, civilized states, call them what you will. So this is a useful thing to think about because it does have ramifications for our understanding of all sorts of societies and relationships between different communities, not just in the Roman period, but before and more widely. Still, I guess before I start, I really ought to justify to some extent the claim I'm making that raiding and this sort of small-scale military activity is very, very common in most of the ancient world at most periods. Because, again, I think it's there in the sources, but people don't necessarily highlight it. And of course, then we've got to consider just how frequent it might be. So let's begin with the Romans. As far as possible, I'll take sources from the Roman period, but I will go a little bit earlier and later at times, just because sometimes it seems to help flesh out what we glimpse from our Greco-Roman sources and makes more sense of them. So let's begin with Velleius Paterculus talking about the rule of the Emperor Tiberius. And he talks about the Pax Augusta, which has spread to the regions of the east and of the west and to the bounds of the north and of the south, preserves every corner of the world safe from the fear of brigandage. Again, so the emphasis on the Roman piece there of a historian who is very, very enthusiastic in his portrayal of Tiberius, so a very friendly source, and obviously a patriotic Roman who's been an officer, probably an equestrian officer in the army, who's taken part in campaigns in Europe and served out on the border with the Parthians. So a man of considerable experience. Unfortunately, only a small part of his work survived, and we don't have his detailed accounts of campaigns against the German tribes and this sort of thing, which would be wonderful to give us more idea of what's going on with something that we tend to see more through short passages and then we glimpse in the archaeology. But again, he's emphasizing that the big threat to the Roman peace is not so much major wars against great powers, it's against brigandage, banditry, raiding. And there are times where the Romans include under this banner quite specifically groups of people who've come from outside the empire but who attack into the province to steal, to murder, and to get away with their plunder. So this is a source where the Romans are even emphasizing that this is a problem that will happen unless there is a good emperor and a good empire, like the Roman Empire under Tiberius, able to impose order, able to stop this sort of thing from actually happening. So again, we're not talking about the big battles, the big conflicts, we're talking about something much smaller. Let's come back, let's go a little bit earlier, let's go to the 3rd century BC, and there's an interesting papyrus from Ptolemaic Egypt. Now, this talks about sailors and seafarers who come ashore and how they are to be received by the officials of the Ptolemaic kingdom. What's the attitude to them? It says, "But if any, being driven by a storm and not able to anchor on the promontory when they come to the harbour and its appurtenances, let them announce to the police the reason and the place in which they have anchored. To those who have reported, the chief of police will send a guard adequate to protect them while they are moored, so that no violence may be done." It's not really specific as to on which side this violence is expected to come from, and there may be an element of both. Obviously, if some merchants are blown ashore or there's not room for them in the harbour and they're forced ashore and they land somewhere and they've got lots of nice, shiny, valuable things, then any criminal element locally might think, well, this is a good opportunity, let's go and rob them. Or simply anybody who thinks they can get away with it and doesn't have any particular reason to like these strangers that have come from elsewhere. But there's also the concern that these strangers might be people who are perhaps posing as traders, but perhaps they're not averse to a little bit of kidnapping to take people to sell as slaves, or theft, again, on the basis that they'll be going away soon, so they won't be able to be caught by the authorities. So there's an effort by Ptolemaic authorities, and we can argue another time about whether the use of the word police is a legitimate translation in this context. It's more the idea I want to emphasize that you never quite knew when strangers arrived in your territory for most of ancient history whether or not they were friendly. And this is something to which we'll return later because it's significant about how the process of raiding works. Most people come probably for harmless reasons, probably to trade, reasons that are beneficial to both of you. They have something they want to buy, they want to sell you, you might have something you want to sell them. It works both ways. Now, obviously, people who come from the sea have a particularly easy means of escape afterwards, but it can also be true of those who come by land. And there is a connection that you see in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, the assumption that people who arrive by sea might decide to do a bit of plundering, particularly if they have a lot of warriors with them, therefore they've got the capacity to do it. So here's an interesting quote from the Odyssey when Odysseus visits the underworld, and apart from dealing with the quest he's on at the time, he talks to several of the Greeks with whom he'd fought at Troy, but who are now, much to his surprise, because he hasn't had much news on his long and arduous journey back home, is discovering that they have in fact died. So when he meets Agamemnon, who has in fact been murdered at home, in fact, on the basis of in the story, obviously, he talks to Agamemnon, Lord of men, what doom of distressful death overmastered you? Did Poseidon rouse some hideous blast of contrary winds and destroy you among the ships that went with you? Or did hostile men strike you down on land as you drove off their flocks and herds or battled to win their town and women? It's quite a startling assumption whereby he talks about these as hostile, you would think unsurprisingly. If Agamemnon's men have landed and then decided, well, let's take what we want from this. We're not going to pay, we're just going to capture their women, take their cattle to eat, we're going to burn their town down and plunder it, that unsurprisingly, the locals don't look too favourably on this, so therefore they fight. The point I want to emphasise is not so much how historical this is, though clearly both the Iliad and the Odyssey assume a level of realism within their story. This is something to which its audience could relate. The idea that, yes, this is the sort of thing that kings and their warriors might do, and this is the sort of thing that might happen to you. Now, whether implied is the assumption that had Agamemnon landed and the locals realized this is a great king of Greece with lots of troops at his back, lots of warships full of armed men, if we're very polite to him, if we welcome him, if we give him gifts, then we can be friends. But if we're a bit standoffish, we could look out for trouble because he needs to be treated with respect. There is an element you get coming back again and again in the ancient world that if you're strong, then you'll get treated better than if you're perceived to be weak. And that how you deal with others, with strangers with whom you don't have any particular connection up to this point, is very much based around a perception of how strong they are in relation to how strong you are. Therefore, if you're the stronger one, they need to show respect to you. Otherwise, you can use force to take what you want, you can plunder them. But also, if they're stronger than you, then you need to be very careful and very polite to make sure they don't attack you first. So let's come back, let's go more firmly into the Roman period, and let's look at stories that are told by Greek and Roman sources of some of the peoples of the Iberian Peninsula, and particularly the Lusitanians in the area, roughly speaking, that would become modern-day Portugal. And several sources attest to the similar idea. You have, from Diodorus Siculus, one special custom is followed among the Iberians, and especially among the Lusitanians. Among those who are at the prime of life, those poorest in property but outstanding in strength and courage, furnish themselves with weapons and resources, gather in the harsh mountain regions, and forming quite significant bands, they overrun Iberia and collect wealth by plundering. This is something that will appear, as I say, again and again, where people cannot support themselves because they don't have land, they don't have property, they don't have animals, but they're young and they're strong, then they turn raider, they turn bandit, they turn warrior. And you have, Tacitus will talk about this with the Germans, that if there wasn't much going on in their own tribe, ambitious warriors would go off and take service with the leader in another one to get the chance to fight. You can win glory that way. And a striking feature as well, we'll talk about this in some detail in one of the historical lectures sometime in the future when I get around to it. But for those of you who remember Pompey's campaign against the pirates in the 60s BC, he settles it quite quickly, and primarily he does this not by the physical destruction of the pirate strongholds, but by transplanting the population to areas of better land and other cities where they can actually support themselves. They don't need to be pirates anymore because they have a livelihood with which they can support themselves and families. So this is something, again, that crops up again and again in the ancient world. If you don't have enough and you're strong, then you take it from someone else. And that's an assumption that appears again and again in the sources. Now, it might not be universal, but it does appear to be common. Now, this is another one from Strabo talking about the same area. It's a long, long quote, so I won't read all of it, but here we've got, if you part way down, it was the mountaineers who began this lawlessness. So it was likely to be the case, for since they occupied sorry land and possessed but little property, they coveted what belonged to others. And later, in defending themselves against the mountaineers, and the latter, in defending themselves against the mountaineers, were necessarily rendered powerless over their private estates, so that they too began to engage in war instead of farming. And the result was that the country, neglected because it was barren of planted products, became the home only of brigands. It's quite interesting that even an ancient source can see a relation between an area that suffers depredations from one group of attackers, tries to defend itself. The people there have a choice. You can either be robbed all the time and starve, or you defend yourselves. You know, it's all a little bit Magnificent Seven or Seven Samurai, depending on your tastes in movies. I like both of them personally. But it's this idea that in those cases you go and hire someone to protect you, but otherwise you arm yourself and you prepare yourself, or you build fortifications, or you seek refuge in places of difficult access to defend yourself. But if you are forced to spend all that effort fighting, and if you cannot cultivate your fields as well as you could before, or care for your flocks, your herds as well as you could before, you become poorer, which makes you more desperate, and now that you've become armed, you might choose to raid somebody else. So there's an element of vicious circle about all of this, that once it starts, others can start to turn towards similar acts of violence, sometimes reprisals against the people who've attacked them, but also finding other victims elsewhere on their borders that they feel can make up what they've lost from the others. And if you look at most Iron Age settlements in most parts of Europe, and also more widely throughout the ancient world, many are protected. Fortified is perhaps too strong a word. We've talked already a little bit about the hill forts of Iron Age Britain. And some of these are absolutely huge, Maiden Castle being one of the biggest. And you can see it's got 3 banks of ramparts, ditches, gates only at either end. And those involve a very complicated approach where presumably all the time, apart from getting disorientated and lost, you've got people lobbing bricks down, shooting sling bullets at you. They found large quantities of sling stones, ammunition in Danebury, for instance, piled up ready for the defenders to bombard anyone attacking them. So this looks like a pretty formidable military position. You can justify fortification in this term. Although you've then got to say, well, it's a very long perimeter, so that's vulnerable. Can the enemy distract you in one place and then manage to scramble over somewhere else? So do you need a lot of people to defend this? You obviously need a lot of people to build it in the first place. It's in Dorset now, in southwestern England, and one of the striking things about that area that probably corresponds to the territory of the Dura-Triges is the large number of hill forts, often quite close together. And that rather suggests that you've got not one or two centralized authorities and powers, but lots of chieftains, leaders who dominate from their own particular stronghold. But you've also got within the Iron Age the farmstead that might be half a dozen huts, perhaps not even that many, that very often has a ditch around it and sign of a rampart, stockade. You know, these are common, these are fairly typical settlements in Roman Britain. The Iron Age people in Britain, generally speaking, don't seem to go for villages, but they do go for farms, extended family farms, presumably, and many of them have some degree of protection. Now, we'll come back to just what this means, but you're talking about a rampart, perhaps, though it might be a stockade rather than something where you have a fighting platform behind it, depending on the size. Both are attested, or at least plausible reconstructions of the archaeology in various sites, and a ditch around it. Now, the ditch probably has at least one entrance, perhaps only the one, which allows you to go in and out. Presumably that would be blocked by some sort of gate, temporary fence, barricade, whatever it might be. Now, this is, in military terms, not a hugely formidable position, in that it's quite small, so a large force attacking it could probably overwhelm it. But again, this is something we'll talk about a bit later on. What should we be thinking about as the threat that these sorts of defensive measures are meant to meet and to counteract? Because I think sometimes archaeologists and scholars tend to come to something like this and they think always in terms of large battles, big armies. And then they look at the societies involved and think, well, how often is that type of warfare likely to occur? I think the key to understanding many of these things, and indeed Roman frontier systems, is actually to look at what we're talking about today and consider raiding, and often conducted by relatively small groups of people. Now, let's see. Again, we come back. I've already mentioned Pompey and the pirates, but to emphasize how it's poverty of land, the inability to feed yourselves, and particularly in the case where you have a population that can no longer support itself on the resources available to it, and within that population, a lot of young men who are willing to take the risks of going to war, going on the warpath, going raiding. So again, this is Servius Sulpicius Galba in 150 BC, and this is from Appian's account. Now, this would lead to a famous massacre of the Lusitanians, but before that happens, and the pretext for the settlement involving the tribes coming in with their families, with their flocks, with their possessions to be resettled by the Romans, was this, that Galba understood, as the Roman proconsul, that they'd only broken the treaty with the Romans and attacked Rome's allies because they were forced to through poverty. For, he said, poorness of soil and penury force you to do these things, but I will give my poor friends good land and settle them in a fertile country in 3 divisions. So again, it's just as Pompey understood, it's a relationship between this is our population, we can't support ourselves, therefore to survive we're going to take it from someone else. And that then can have that knock-on effect where others are forced onto the warpath as well. So, again, Cicero talking about Pompey and arguing in favour of his imperium. He talks about, so this is back in the 1st century BC, we who in former days, besides keeping the whole of Italy safe, were able to guarantee the safety of all our allies in the farthest coasts by the prestige of our empire. Delos, although set far from Rome in the Aegean Sea and visited by men of every country with their merchandise and their cargoes, packed though the island was with riches, small though it was and defenceless, had nothing to fear. The perception that when there is a strong central authority, in this case, Cicero is claiming that until now the Romans have dominated the area, they've seemed sufficiently strong that they've deterred pirates from going to Delos, which had become a major trading post and particularly one of the centres of the Mediterranean slave trade. So huge numbers of valuable slaves passed through this area as well as other goods that were tempting targets for those who could steal them and then sell them on and make a profit themselves. So he is of course arguing for Pompey to be given the command so that he can go and sort this out and sort out other problems then later on with Mithridates. And again, he's talking about the another speech a little bit later, and it's talking about Macedonia in the consulship of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. This is when Cicero explains what happens when there isn't a strong force, a strong authority that is out there to curb the people who might be inclined to go raiding, to go stealing, to go become bandits and raiders. It says, this province is now so harassed by barbarians, whose greed has made them break the peace, that the people of Thessalonica, dwelling in the very heart of our imperium, are forced to abandon their city and fortify their citadel, that our great military road, the Via Ignatia, through Macedonia as far as the Hellespont, is not only endangered by raiding barbarians, but even studded and dotted with Thracian encampments. So this is the picture that the Romans give us time and time again, is that if you're not strong, if you're not seen to be strong, then you will be attacked, or your allies will be attacked. So as an imperial power, you're only going to keep those allies if you continually present this image of strength which deters anybody else from attacking them and keeps them safe, because otherwise they're going to either find somebody else who's a bigger, stronger ally, something Caesar plays upon in Gaul time and time again, and you have Ariovistus, for instance, and the German tribes at other times. Or you might arm yourself, and then if you arm yourself and fight effectively, well, why do you need the Romans as friends? Because you're doing everything for yourself. So again, there is an assumption that warfare, and in most cases that warfare is primarily raiding, though it can be on a very large scale, and it can lead to invasion and permanent occupation, or more serious attacks of other sorts, is very, very frequent. Julius Caesar, for instance, claims that upon the incidents of war, and before Caesar's coming to Gaul, this would happen well nigh every year, in the sense they would either make wanton attacks themselves or repelling such. They'd have to fight to defend their own territory, or they'd be going robbing somebody else. Now, obviously, Julius Caesar has intervened in Gaul, stretching to the very limit his remit as governor of the province allocated by the Senate to intervene ever further afield, eventually end up in Britain, bridge the Rhine twice, all of these things. So it is in Caesar's interest to present the Gauls as warlike and unstable and dangerous to Rome's allies, which therefore means dangerous to Rome's interest. Therefore, I have to do all this and I have to go and dominate them and defeat them and conquer them. So he's inclined to exaggerate, but again, as with everything Caesar says, it's an exaggeration that would be accepted at Rome, and he didn't have freedom to invent all that much because so many of his own officers are writing regularly back to Rome, and there are other people in Rome who have at least personal knowledge of the Transalpine province of Gaul, modern-day Provence, and perhaps beyond, but certainly of that area. But again, it's a constant theme in the commentaries. So think of how he describes the Helvetii and the reason for their migration. So the Helvetii are closely confined by the nature of their territory. In such circumstances, their range of movement was less extensive, and their chances of waging war on their neighbours were less easy, and on this account they were greatly distressed, for they were men that longed for war. So Caesar is presenting them as a warlike nation, by their very nature, by their society. So they like to feel strong, they like to see powerful, and they feel that they're confined by, again, the area of roughly modern-day Switzerland, but it's a little more complicated than that. There are too many mountains in the way. There aren't enough rich targets within reach of the Helvetii for them to go out and to dominate and to plunder. And therefore they think, well, let's move to some nicer lands where we've got not only better farmland, but also lots of people we can prey upon and rob and plunder, and then they'll either submit to us, which makes us stronger, or they'll end up as continual victims, sheep to shear whenever we want to. So again, this is a theme that's there time and time again. It's this perception again that if somebody seems weak and they have things worth taking, that there is a good chance that neighbours or people from even further afield will come and will take it from them by force, because they can. And war in this era in the wider ancient world rarely seems to need much pretext. It is simply a case of we keep peace with enemies that either we have long established friendship with and to our mutual benefit, or more often it's because we're a bit afraid of them. We don't want to take the risk. War is too risky against them, therefore peace is a better idea, is a safer bet. But that within that you can have individuals within society who will decide that actually there's nothing in their interest in keeping the peace. They have nothing, they don't have land, they don't have wealth, therefore let's go and fight and take some. And this, is the motive of many societies in many periods of history. And it often might be a minority of people who do this, in the same way that it's a minority of people from the Scandinavian nations who will go Viking in later centuries, but they will be a very visible presence in the wider world, and that's what people will think of when they come to think of those nations, not of the farmers and the traders and the merchants who sit at home and the craftsmen who get on with doing things. And there is some overlap sometimes. Again, we'll come back to that. But this is the constant theme. Warfare, and warfare in its form of raiding, is always likely to happen unless there is a sense of strength and fear, intimidation, to deter it. There's also the downside of that, of course, that if somebody continually intimidates you, you're not likely to like them. So whenever they seem at all vulnerable, you'll be all the more inclined to go and attack and raid them. So it isn't one of those things that solves the problem, but it's an aspect of it. Now let's go slightly outside and look at, again, a rather revealing passage from part of the Ulster cycle, this early medieval Irish literature that seems to hark back to stories and traditions from the Iron Age. It involves chariots and headhunting and all this sort of thing. So in the Toyne, the cattle raid of Cooley, which is one of the centerpieces of this, you have, in a sense, the explanation for why Maeve of Connaught, the Queen of Connaught, will launch this big raid into the Kingdom of Ulster that will hit at a time when its warriors are vulnerable and will lead to all the heroic defence by Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, the great hero of the cycle. And this is how it's explained, which is quite interesting. It's once when the royal bed was laid out for Ailill and Maeve, and I apologise for my pronunciation of the Irish, is not one of my languages, so I don't, I'm guessing with the names. In the fort in Connaught, they had this talk on their pillow. So first of all, the king starts. It struck me how much better off you are today than the day I married you. You know, yeah, this is in first lessons to new husbands or anyone else. This is not what you say, or vice versa. And Maeve replies, I was well enough off without you. King obviously doesn't realise the danger signal, so then your wealth was something I didn't know or hear much about, except for your women's things and the neighbouring enemies making off with loot and plunder. So the Queen then obviously is still pretty miffed by this. It still remains, Maeve said, that my fortune is greater than yours. To which the king replies, you amaze me. No one has more property or jewels or precious things than I have, and I know it. And then they go and they compare basically their wealth and who's got the best of this, the best of that. And eventually it's the king has a better bull than the queen. The queen discovers there's an even better one in Ulster, so therefore gathers her army and leads this big invasion to raid and to take this famous bull. So whilst this is heroic poetry, it is not intended to be 100% realistic. These are stories that, apart from being embellished and modified over the centuries, they're written down much later than the society they claim to describe. Nevertheless, it's the same assumption that the king claims that, oh, well, you know, you weren't very rich because people were just stealing things from you. They knew you were weak and therefore you don't have the power that I had. You don't frighten your enemies. And that the whole motivation is, well, competition between a king and a queen over prestige, over honour, over wealth, leads to the major war of this great epic poem, because they go out to capture the bull. So let's go, again, we've taken ourselves outside the Roman world a little bit, both before and after, but it's just a reminder, and you could repeat much of this evidence for many areas of the ancient world, the broader classical world, in most periods. Raiding does seem to be very common, whether it's people from the steppes raiding northeastern regions of the Sasanian Empire, or it's in North Africa, and we'll come back to some of those cases before it's in Ptolemaic Egypt or earlier Egypt. Whether, you know, you could go on to, I don't know, the Sea Peoples or any other in earlier Near Eastern history. You have this pattern, raid, theft, a lot of the raiding to humiliate, to intimidate, but also for profit. Now let's go to something more formal, and this is from Ulpian, one of the codifiers of Roman law, and he talks about the duties of a proconsul, drawing on earlier sources as well as the later ones. And it's there in the digest. So, it is right for a competent and conscientious governor to see to it that the province of which he has charge is peaceful and quiet. He will achieve this without difficulty if he carefully ensures that evil men are expelled and hunts them out. He should hunt out sacrilegious persons, brigands, kidnappers and thieves, punish each one according to his crime, and should also bring force against those who harbour them, since a criminal cannot escape detection for long without their help. And then if we go a little bit further on into the digest again, the source is Ulpian, ultimately, where he talks about the different types of enemies. Because obviously the implication, if you're reading that earlier passage about the governor, rather suggests large-scale crime, bandits perhaps rather than foreign enemies. But let's look at this, because this is how the Romans start to define in their own mind and legally just how, what people are considered to be. So, enemies are those on whom the Roman people has formally declared war, or who have themselves declared war on the Roman people. The rest are described as bandits or robbers. For that reason, a man captured by brigands is not their slave, but a man captured by enemies, for example by Germans or Parthians, is their slave, and can recover his original status by the right of post liminium. So this is a case where a Roman citizen has been captured, and does he lose his rights? Because if you're captured by a formally recognized foreign enemy, then effectively you become a slave. And there's a process you have to pass through to become a citizen again, even when you're released. So, but they have this distinction. There are the bandits, and some of the people who would be raiders coming from outside the empire and crossing into Roman territory would probably fall into that category, because it's occurring at a time when there isn't formally declared war between the Romans and whichever society and group they come from. So that's the background to raiding. But now let's look at the mechanics of raiding itself, because if we think about how it was done, we can probably make more sense of how Roman frontiers are arranged, how Iron Age settlements are defended, how people are organized, and just how it's supposed to work. Because we're dealing with a different set of problems to those faced by an army fighting a conventional war. And again, this applies to both sides. So let's consider, and I think in many ways, one of the best ways to think about a raid is actually to come to something much more modern and think of the parallel of the operations room, the ops room in the Battle of Britain, or when the Allies were launching their bombing campaign against Germany and German-occupied territory in Europe, where we're familiar with the picture of, from films and from real archive footage, of the big map and the people, often WAFs, the women auxiliaries in the British context and quite often in the German context as well, pushing around markers showing where reports of enemy air raids are coming in, so that they can move the fighters in, direct them in to intercept in the most favourable conditions for the defenders. The attackers have been planning all of this before. They're trying to outwit the defenders. But the key thing is with a raid, and that's the thing that distinguishes it most from other types of warfare, is that in almost every case, a raid is meant to go into enemy territory, do things, and then return home or return to your base. Now, there are a few cases, we've already had the one with Calpurnius Piso, where Cicero is criticizing his governorship of Macedonia, claiming where the raiders are so confident that they actually set up camp and base in Roman territory so that they can raid in a more methodical way. But the idea is still there. In the main, they're probably not thinking of occupying that forever, but it's a case of this is useful to us to make it easier to do what we're doing. So the key thing is, rather like it's very obvious with aircraft in a modern context, that they have only so much fuel, therefore this limited range. They can travel so far to bomb a target or to escort the bombers to that target, and then they've got to get back to their bases, because if you don't do that, you've lost all your bombers and you haven't got them back for another raid and another raid. That's the other point that's useful to this. Raids are not generally meant to win a war or a conflict on their own. This is not a one-off, right, this will frighten you so much or do so much damage that we're done. The war is over, you will seek peace. They are more of a cumulative process whereby you attack again and again and again, and you wear the enemy down. And you also gain the plunder you want, if that's what it's about. So again, it's worth thinking about the ticking clock, effectively. When you launch a raid, you've only got a limited amount of time in most circumstances, and you want to get there and you want to get home. So let's go to Caesar again as we move on to the mechanics of things. Now, Caesar claims that the German tribes account it the highest praise by devastating their borders to have areas of wilderness as wide as possible around them. They think it the true sign of valour when their neighbours are driven to retire from their lands, and no man dares settle near. And at the same time, they believe they will be safer thereby, having removed all fear of a sudden inroad. So Caesar is saying, really, it's all the things we've been talking about so far. A German tribe is an organised body, a group that is warlike, living amongst lots of other warlike communities. And that's always the nature of once, if somebody starts it, then everyone else has to arm to defend themselves. But they work on this principle. They want to intimidate their enemy. So if they can keep this depopulated strip of land around their own territory, that serves two purposes. One, it shows how tough they are, how hard they are, how frightening they are. Don't mess with us, because we are strong and we will defeat you. That's the message it sends. So that's an element of intimidation, but intimidation is partly meant as well to stop people attacking you. You don't appear vulnerable, therefore you're not attacked. But also it gives warning, because it means that the enemy have got to start from further away. But of course, that implies that there's somebody out there who's at least keeping an eye on what's going on in that area. And let's have a hint of reality. This is from a sadly now lost inscription that was found up near Hadrian's Wall. And it's from a prefect of cavalry, Quintus Calpurnius Concessinius, who after slaughtering a band of Corionototai fulfilled his vow to a god of the most efficacious power. Now that's a very rare mention of a Roman source that actually talks about meeting and defeating a band of raiders. Now this is the only time that name for some Iron Age community ever appears. So unless there were just very few of them and the Romans killed them on this one occasion, it reminds us of how complicated tribal identities and allegiances might be. And again, this is, as so often, this is a theme we can talk about another time. So let's have another one as well, where this is from several very similar inscriptions set up by the Emperor Commodus. And we all know him as the bad emperor from Gladiator, or from, if you go back further, Fall of the West. Not Fall of the West, Fall of the Roman Empire. The old Alec Guinness as Marcus Aurelius film. And this is where Commodus fortified the whole riverbank with forts, burges, constructed from the ground, and also with garrisons, praesidies, stationed at advantageous places against the clandestine crossings of robbers, at clandestinos latrunculum transitus. So again, the Romans are referring to people coming from outside the empire as robbers, in this case, as latrones is the root of the word, bandits. It's often been leste in Greek. But these are people coming from outside the empire attacking in, and you've set up these outposts to try and deal with them. And then there's another example that probably relates to northern Britain and refers to a centurion Cocceius Firmus, who seems to be quite a superstitious or just very religious chap, depending on how you look at it, because he set up an awful lot of altars in Britain and elsewhere in the Roman Empire. But here again, we come back to the Digest, this collection of legal rulings and laws that explains how the Roman law should work. And it comes back to the thing we mentioned before about the restoration of rights as a citizen when you're captured by raiders. Depends on who the raiders are, whether they are formally recognized as enemies or whether they're just criminals. But this is quite an interesting one from the 2nd century, because it talks about a woman condemned for a crime to hard labour in the salt works was subsequently captured by bandits of an alien race. In the course of lawful trade, she was sold and by repurchase returned to her original condition. The purchase price had to be refunded from the imperial treasury to the centurion Cocceius Firmus. So this is someone who's been forced to be a slave as a result of criminal activity, or at least so the Roman authorities claim, sent to a hard labour, captured by raiders, by bandits, taken off, and then sold as a slave, but sold into the Roman Empire because she's purchased by the centurion Cocceius Firmus, who, when her identity is revealed and it turns out that she isn't his slave and they didn't have a right to sell her, he is compensated because he was innocent. He didn't know that the bandits or merchant, whoever he actually bought her from, he didn't know that they didn't have a right to own her and sell her. So it's that reminder that Roman law will treat human beings very much as property in the slave sense, and that's the Roman attitude. And then finally, this is a fairly recent discovery, this marvellous inscription from not far from modern Augsburg. And this refers to a victory in 260 AD. And it's worth going through at length, even though it's quite a big inscription, because again, it reminds us of the sort of thing that's going on. So it's in honour of the divine house and to the blessed goddess Victoria, because the barbarians of the race of the Semnones or Euthungi, again, they don't seem to quite know who these Germans were, who these barbarian raiders were, but they were slaughtered and routed on the 8th and 7th days before the calends of May by soldiers of the province of Rhaetia, by soldiers from Germany and by militia, after freeing many thousands of Italian prisoners, and in the realization of his vow, Marcus Simplicius Genialis Vir Perfectissimus, acting in place of the governor, with the same army, and with proper gratitude erected and dedicated this altar on the 3rd day before the Ides of September, when our Emperor Postumus Augustus and Honoratianus were consuls. Now, there's all sorts of stuff about the Gallic Empire in the 3rd century that we could go into in that. But the interesting thing is that they have caught a presumably quite large band of raiders, and over 2 days have defeated these Germanic tribesmen who've been all the way to Italy, have taken captives and were on their way home with them. Again, it's a reminder, this is a raid, you want to profit from this raid. To profit from this raid, you need to get home. And in this case, the Romans have stopped them on the way back. So, let's consider some of the things the raiders might want to do. So raiders who come into the Roman provinces might have all sorts of objectives in mind. One of the most obvious and most frequent is captives. But there are other forms of plunder, and sometimes you have a situation whereby there's an element of wanting to hurt someone who's perceived to be an enemy or perceived to be a victim, to show your status, your courage, by inflicting damage. So you might come to kill as well. And many societies, anthropologists will trace this, will have aspects of murder raid, where warriors are going into enemy territory because they need to prove themselves as warriors, and that might be by killing. And it can be a rite of passage at various stages in their life. And you might destroy as well as gather things that you can take home as plunder. So there's a rather grim find from, again, the 3rd century AD, from a villa near Regensburg, Harting, in Germany, where 13 of the inhabitants were slaughtered, and some of them were dismembered, some of them were scalped. There are clear marks on the skulls of this before the bodies, what's left, is tipped down a well at this villa. Now, in this case, a group of attackers has come and clearly decided that they don't want these people as captives, they're too much trouble, or they simply are not looking for that, but they want to torture, to mutilate, to kill. And, all the unpleasantness. You might have warriors that are coming to do this sort of thing, to rape, to murder, as well as simply to take things that they can steal. Probably the balance of the sources is that killing for the sake of killing is, in most cases, secondary, but not in all. And more often what they want is plunder. They want loot. Now, again, there have been a couple of really impressive finds dredged up from the Rhine in recent years. And this is one of them, where a wagon is loaded up with plunder taken from the Roman provinces. And the raiders who'd done this were trying to get back across the river, back home to safety, but they were floating this wagon full of their loot, their plunder, on a raft that must have sunk, and that was it. It was lost. Now, most of what's in there is not gold and jewels and silks and all the really expensive, high status, prestigious, exceptionally valuable objects that do exist in the Roman Empire. It's shiny things. It's tools. It's metalwork. It's ceramics. It's all sorts of things that are fairly mundane, to be honest, but they might not be available to someone who's living beyond the Roman frontier, and the further east they go, these things are likely to be all the rarer and also, crucially, all the more expensive. So some of these are useful things. These are worth stealing, but it is more like someone breaking into a house and stealing a television or, a computer, these sorts of things. It's not going into the Bank of England and stealing all the bullion, or going into an art gallery and stealing a valuable painting. That's what they've bothered to gather, and that's, they think, is worth bringing, literally carting all the way back home, potentially over quite considerable distances, in the same way that the people intercepted and defeated those Yothungi or Semnones, whoever they were. It was worth taking all those captives back. Now, there is an element whereby these things do have value. Clearly, they're useful objects, and slaves are useful as a labour force, but also there is the prestige element of it. It isn't just that you have acquired these things that are useful, you have taken them from an enemy, from foreigners, and you have shown by doing that you are strong, that you are brave, that you are a great warrior. So there is extra prestige attached to all of these because of the way you've acquired them, that makes the whole thing worthwhile. So that's a reminder again about what sort of things raiders might want to do, how they would consider this to be a successful raid, to be a victory. There's also Sadly, it's a chunk of it is broken off, but again, a fairly recent discovery from the routes down to the Red Sea ports beyond Egypt, whereby an amphora has been found. They were using what we call ostraca, fragments of pottery, as notepaper to write on, because papyrus was expensive. So for quick notes down, you would note it on whatever shard of pottery of something that had been broken you didn't need anymore. And so we have on this ostracon, so these ostraca, they're the fragments of pottery they use as notepaper by the Romans in many arid areas in parts of Egypt, North Africa. This is something they're most common. Because papyrus was expensive and you often need a lot of copies of documents, but they're useful for little notes, little reports. Now this one was written by a chap called Antonius Celer, a cavalryman from the century of Proculus in cohors 2 Etruriorum Equitata. And it's sent to one of his officers, to Cassius Victor, centurion in the same cohort. Now, as far as we can tell, Antonius Celer, the man is in charge of this little way station, but he doesn't have any formal rank. He is simply a cavalryman in an auxiliary unit. And that rather suggests that he's not in charge of a lot of men. And the whole tone and detail of the report suggests this is very small scale. And he describes an attack by 60 barbarians on the outpost, the way station of Patkua. So presumably there aren't too many Romans there, but there are civilian travellers sheltering in and around the fort. The attack began at the 10th hour of the day and went on till the 2nd hour of the night, and again around dawn the next day. Hermogenes, an infantryman of the century of Serenus, was killed. 2 other soldiers are wounded. A horse is injured or killed. They're from the century of Proculus. Sadly, most of the detail of this document has been lost, but it seems to talk about civilians that are killed, some children are captured, bodies are found. There's a chunk missing out of the text, which is deeply frustrating. And this was a report to be circulated to all the outposts along the Myos Hormos road. That's this route down to the port at Myos Hormos. And it was to go to prefects, centurions, decurions, duplicari, double paymen, sesquiplicari, that's 1.5 paymen, and post commanders, the curatores, like Antonius Celer, who presumably don't have formal rank. So it's lots of little detachments. And it's one of those enigmatic passages that seems as if it stepped straight out of a John Ford Western. The sudden attack that occurs in several phases. It's not this massed onslaught by lots of barbarians who don't care about their own losses. They're being careful, but they harass. They're going for the civilians, presumably, or perhaps they're trying to get the weapons off the Roman soldiers. But the civilians are most likely, and the goods they're carrying, and the people that they abduct children and women. They're looking for captives that are useful, marketable as slaves, or useful within their own society. But it's very small scale. It is not the sort of thing that you'd expect to be reported in a history of the empire written by an Ammianus Marcellinus or a Caesar or a Tacitus or anything like that. This is very, very small scale. Were it not for this fragmentary document, we wouldn't know anything about it, and we can't even locate the place precisely. You also get hints elsewhere. So let's go to the Talmud and the Jewish sources that are obviously very difficult to date because they bring together themes and rulings and rabbinical discussion and thoughts and interpretation from a wide range of periods. This one is generally dated to around about AD 200, but it's hard to be sure. Now, this says that it is ordained that if Gentiles come on Sabbath upon villages that are close to the border, the inhabitants issue forth fully armed to meet them and return fully armed. This law applies even in the case that they come only to loot straw or wood. If they fall upon villages further in the interior, one may draw out armor only if they attack with the intent to kill. So it is to do with what someone is allowed to do on the Sabbath. And in the case where you're on the borders, it's presumably considered to be more dangerous, that if you don't come out to stop the attackers stealing your wood and your straw, then they'll come back and they'll steal more and they'll kill you. Whereas in the interior, any raiding group that's got that far, it's presumably less common. You can fight them if they're coming to kill you or to kill somebody within your community, but you're not supposed to do it otherwise. Other rulings are similar. This is from a different text. And that talks about none shall raise a dog unless he's kept on a chain, except in a town adjoining the frontier, in which he is permitted to keep the dog unchained, but only at night time. So again, it's that sense of threat, and it might just be the sort of threat that somebody going to burgle your house, but it might also be that a dog will bark and will warn you of a large group of raiders. That's later in date, but seems to be dated on Roman material. You get other discussions where they talk about provisions for watchtowers, watchmen, looking out for natural disasters, wild animals, and raiders, and that the signal for warning or for an alarm was blowing a ram's horn trumpet. So again, it's a reminder of just how would somebody, you're up there on a tower, you're up there in a high position to watch, you're acting as a sort of guard, a sentry. How do you actually alarm people? And in this case, fairly obvious, but it's a good reminder that they do things in a practical way. They sound a trumpet. And you will notice that in Jewish communities, even of Second Temple period, ones that are in areas more exposed to frontier and other communities, often have an element of the defensive about their structures. You could see that even about the Qumran community, they have a tower there and walls around it. So this is somewhere down by the Dead Sea where you're never quite sure, who's going to be coming along in the night or even in daytime. So communities, just like the Iron Age farm with its rampart around it, there are large parts of the Roman Empire where people have an element of concern for their security, but not necessarily security against, this isn't going to stop a major army. The Qumran community is, by the look of it, from the trace of the archaeology, and the swiftly overrun by the Roman army when it comes through. It's not meant to hold off a legion, but it might hold off some robbers, it might even hold off a bigger band of bandits. So let's come back to a final point. There's a wonderful quote from Ammianus Marcellinus after he's described a series of engagements and campaigns on the western frontier in Gaul and this area, many of which involve hundreds rather than thousands of troops on both sides that seem comparatively small. And he also mentions that beside these battles, many others less worthy of mention were fought in various parts of Gaul, which it would be superfluous to describe, both because the results led to nothing worthwhile and because it is not fitting to spin out a history with insignificant details. Now, given, as I say, the small scale of what he does describe, that's really interesting. He just reminds us, look, there's lots going on. This is a troubled area. There's lots of small-scale fighting, warfare, raiding, whatever it might be. One of the most useful and insightful studies of warfare in Ammianus and in that period in later 4th and early 5th century Gaul is Hugh Elton's book, Warfare in Roman Europe. And he notes that Ammianus never seems to describe an attack that has to be met with fewer than 400 Roman troops. So that may be the threshold for what he considers to be a sort of proper action. But even that's not huge. That's, by the standards of the army of the Principate, that's sort of cohort-sized unit dealing with it. So let's try and work through it really as to how you'd be. If you're someone out there who wants to launch a raid, most likely a raid from outside the Roman Empire into the Roman Empire, how do you go about it? How is it actually organized and done? And obviously, first off, you need warriors. You need people willing to go with you. And there is an emphasis in sources about the Iron Age Gallic peoples, the Germans, of the freedom individual warriors had to do what they wanted to do, particularly amongst the Germans, but probably also in quite a lot of other groups, that there were very few chieftains who could say, you have to go and do this. I'm going to launch a raid, you're coming with me. And instead, participation was mainly a matter of choice. Now, another theme that is constantly emphasized and seems to crop up in society after society is that many aristocrats, chieftains, kings, leaders of any sort, display their power by the number of warriors who live in their household. And it's the idea that will be extended later on into Anglo-Saxon huscarls. So you have these people who live off you. They feast in your hall, if it's that sort of society. But they are, as an obligation, they have to fight for you. So you have small groups of professionals, probably the wrong word, but almost full-time or semi-full-time warriors, people for whom that is their main occupation. And again, you get that mention we talked about earlier of Tacitus saying that German warriors who are ambitious and find their own tribes at peace go off and seek service in the household of somebody in another tribe that's at war. So you can gain glory as an individual, which will give you status within the society, by fighting under almost any circumstances. You know, it's the bravery, the individual courage, the individual skill, the success that counts. These tend to be relatively small numbers. Now, obviously, it depends on the importance of the leader, the size and the organization, the structure of the society, where he is. But we're probably talking for many leaders of dozens, and for the major leaders, perhaps a few hundred. There's, again, come back to Ammianus, one of the main kings of the Alemanni has 300 men in his household, 300 warriors fighting with him, and that's probably a pretty important man. So we're mostly looking at fewer than that. And we might want to think about, well, a few dozen, a few score, perhaps even fewer. You know, there might be the leader who just has a handful of men as his warriors that will be obliged to go with him or will suffer dishonor if they don't, because that's part of the obligation. You know, you live with them, you serve them, you take an oath to them, and therefore you're willing to fight and risk your life for them. Along with others who decide that when somebody says, I'm going to launch a raid, you know, it's a sort of classic heroic poetry thing. You announce something at a feast and everyone says, I will join in, or not, as the case may be. So a lot will depend on the reputation of the man in question. Now, with any society like this, you might be able to intimidate your neighbors to joining. With others, you might have put them under obligation to join you. But more importantly, there's your reputation. If you are known as someone who is a great warrior and a successful raider, then people are more likely to say, okay, he's going off again, I'll go with him, because I stand a good chance of gaining plunder, gaining glory, and coming back home safe. Whereas if you are someone whose missions, whose expeditions off to plunder, whether it's other tribes, whether it's the Romans or the Roman provinces, doesn't really matter. If they failed, if people have got killed, or the winnings have been meager, if you're perceived as unlucky, any of these things. These are fairly loosely organized societies. These are not soldiers that are obliged to go, can be ordered to go. Now, the numbers don't have to be great. On the Ostracon we've been talking about just a few minutes ago, 60 barbarians. At least that's how many the Romans say they are. And it might well be that the defenders have inflated the numbers because it seemed like 60. It seemed like a lot coming at them, particularly during the night. So, you know, that's your impression, and it sounds more impressive when you report it. Or they might be faithfully accurate, or there might have been, 100 other warriors who decided that they weren't really interested, so didn't take part. But in most societies, there's an element of personal choice that can, at any stage, be exercised. So you can abandon someone if you go on a raid and it doesn't seem to be going well. So this is all about, again, it emphasizes the importance of successful raiding for status within these communities, because it gives you all sorts of advantages apart from the tangible ones of plunder and, glory. That glory can be translated into power, as can the plunder. And we might want to remember that if you think of, Geronimo, he was raiding with fewer than 20 warriors in the latter operations, but thousands of troops had to be deployed to bring them in. And, large numbers of Apache scouts to track down the Apaches because they were the only people who could find them and keep up with them and chase them. Now, that's an extreme case. Obviously, the landscapes of southwestern America, of Arizona, New Mexico, all these areas, isn't really matched in quite the same scale and population density in the Roman Empire, though on some of the frontiers there are, in Africa and things, there are areas that are similar. But it's just a reminder that it's rather like criminals, in the sense that the police can be kept busy by a relatively small number of criminals because the police don't know where they're going to strike next. And you need to guard lots of places. Companies will have their private security guards to look after their factory, their office, whatever it might be, their shop, their warehouse. And they'll have to put them on all of them because they don't know that somebody might not strike there next. And if you don't have them, that's an invitation to say, well, you can come and rob me. Closed circuit television performs much the same purpose, in that if there's an area that's watched, then that's perceived to be a more dangerous target to take out. So again, we don't need to be talking always about vast numbers of raiders, but we come back to the point from early on that if small raids go in and succeed, then the odds are that bigger raids will come in subsequently. So let's assume that a chieftain has decided to launch a raid on the Roman Empire, into the Roman provinces. He needs to gather warriors. He may have a few at his disposal, maybe he's got quite a lot at his disposal, and they are probably the better equipped. And in many cases, even if they do not particularly plan on fighting as cavalry as we would understand them, they know how to ride, and that adds an extra element to your raiding capacity, because of course if you're mounted you can go further, and whether that's mounted on a horse or in some regions whether it's mounted on a camel. But it makes you faster. It makes you able to cover more ground more quickly than if you're on foot. Although again, in some cases you might be on foot and that might allow you to be more stealthy, or the terrain, if it's particularly rugged, you might not be able to ride there too easily. Let's look, there's a still from the fall of the Roman Empire of barbarians pouring through the woods. That's the sudden attack. That's what you want, or at least it's not what you want, because that's obviously a big battle and an ambush. You want to be a bit more subtle than that, but in the end, you're your chieftain who needs to persuade enough people, convince enough people, cajole enough people to come with you on a raid. Now, what do you want? Glory, obviously, prestige, probably some tangible benefit. And we'll look at a passage from Tacitus describing some large-scale raids in AD 50. And again, it's quite long, so I won't read the whole thing, just the highlighted section. And this talks about the panic caused by an incursion of the Chatti. Now again, they're described as, in terms of bandits. They're latrones. And the legate has sent auxiliaries, infantry supported by cavalry, to head off the raiders, or if they scattered, to envelop and surprise them. The Roman troops separated into two columns, one of which, marching to the left, entrapped a newly returned detachment of pillagers who, after employing their booty in a debauch, were sleeping off the effects. And they're massacred because they're basically caught drunk. Now again, these raiders have presumably come because they want plunder, but they also want to enjoy themselves. And in this case, they've had a great booze up because they've obviously discovered wine or beer or whatever it might be. They've eaten a lot, they've drunk a lot. They may have done all sorts of unpleasant things to any captives they have, as we had from that Regensburg site. But they've taken time. But these are people who've come not to destroy the Roman Empire. They've come to plunder, to have a good time, to celebrate, show how brave they are, but actually then to slip off before the Roman army turns up in big numbers. Instead, they've got themselves drunk and they are slaughtered in those circumstances. There's another case that we might look at later where Ammianus Marcellinus, centuries later, talks about a group that's surprised while again they're sleeping, they're partly drunk, and some of them are by a river dyeing their hair red, these Germanic warriors, and they're surprised by the Romans. Now, let's continue the passage of Tacitus, because there's more. And their companions, that's the other group of barbarians, who'd taken the shorter route by the right, I'm getting it wrong. These are actually, we're talking about the Romans, not the barbarians. They'd taken a shorter route by the right, inflicted graver loss on the enemy who met them and risked a set engagement. So in this case, the raiders hadn't necessarily come to fight, but are willing to do so or feel obliged to do so when they've bumped into a Roman column, or a Roman column has caught up with them and they think they can take them out, but in fact they fight and suffer even worse. But laden with their spoils and honours, they return, so the Romans have succeeded. Now, the legate was waiting with the legions in the hope that the Chatti, anxious for revenge, would afford him the opportunity to battle. They, however, being afraid of being caught between the Romans on the one side and their eternal enemies, the Cherusci, on the other, sent deputations to Rome with hostages, and triumphal honours are awarded to the Roman legate. So it's interesting, the Romans are thinking in terms, or the local commander is thinking, well, these raids have come in, I've punished them, but because I've hurt the Chatti, maybe that will provoke them to mass a big army and risk a battle with me, in which case I can fight a proper, fully fledged, glorious pitched battle, hammer them, and add reputation for myself and to my family's name. All great stuff, very Roman, what an aristocrat wants to do, but in the proper context of the imperial period, in that he only gets the ornaments of a triumph, not a proper triumph, because only the imperial family can have those, or only really the emperor in most circumstances by this stage. So that's a case where groups have come in, they've been caught in different circumstances and behaved in different circumstances. So let's go on to Ammianus Marcellinus, and here's another incident. This is from 353 AD, about the Isaurians, so we're moving over to the eastern part of the empire. And they normally keep peace, but they now abandon everything because the conditions are disturbed by sudden raids. And instead of secret plundering expeditions, as with impunity stimulated for the worst by their growing boldness, broke out in a serious war, especially exasperated by the indignity of some of their associates who'd been taken prisoner, thrown to the beasts in the amphitheatre. So the Romans have captured some of this tribe that have been raiding within the Roman Empire. This is one of those, what scholars tend to call an internal frontier, where you have people living in a mountainous area who are not that settled and are inclined to chance their arm raiding whenever they think they can get away with it. And they have raided, they start to raid more widely, as I said, partly a reprisal because the Romans have captured some of them and executed them in the arena, come down from the mountains, observe an anchorage, and they see ships in the harbour. The moon still being crescent, so not shining with full brilliance. They catch the sailors asleep, they massacred them all, and without resistance carried off the cargoes, led either by their value or their usefulness. So again, they're choosing things that they think are useful for them or are valuable or prestigious, and that they can carry as well. You'll also physically be able to get it away. So news spread, other ships avoid the port from now on. After a while, the raiders move inland because nobody else is coming in to be attacked. Blocked the roads, lived on the property of travellers. Roman soldiers are not responding as they should. While those in the regions, each unit strove to the best of its power to check the marauders, range more widely, now in solid bodies, sometimes even in isolated bands, but the soldiers are defeated because, again, they don't know where the raiders are. And there are a lot of raiders. Numbers and hardiness of the Azorean mountaineers and the mountainous terrain. However, bands caught in open country were massacred, and so they moved on, this time to Pamphylia, but after traversing mountain passes, they're stopped by a flooded river. The delay, they look for boats and food, they're caught by the legions, and they kill a lot of them, but some marauders escape, they keep moving, they attack several more targets, until eventually they are caught by a significant part of the Roman field army, and they're scattered, after their usual fashion, made for the trackless wastes of the high mountains. So again, that's an incident where you see the escalation. People who habitually raid have scented a chance, and they're angry with the Romans because the Romans have killed some of their own. So they raid on a larger scale, and because it's not stopped, they raid for longer, they go for bigger targets. When they get chased, they move to another area, raid there. And it takes a long time before the main body is defeated, but even then, a lot of them escape and get home. Okay, so we have our chieftain. He's gathered together a group of followers, some the warriors of his household, some other enthusiasts who want to prove themselves, want plunder, drawn by his reputation, or willing to chance an arm. You've then got the situation where once you start on the raid and the plan, where again, it's all to do with the ticking clock. There's a limited amount of time to do this. The Azorians were able to move from one area to the next, but in the end they get caught, although a lot of them still escape. So the first thing you really need is to know what you want to attack. You need targets. You need intelligence, for want of a better word. And that's something that can be gathered in various ways, so that you'll tend to know if you live next door to somebody for a long time, whether it's another tribe, whether it's the Roman Empire, the best routes into and out of their territory, and the ones that are easier to traverse, the ones that are more secret, but also where their main communities are, perhaps where their outlying farms are. But you won't necessarily know all the details, and the further afield you go, the more likely you are to have bigger, less well-protected, perhaps wealthier targets that will be easier to surprise. So if you want to do a big raid, you need intelligence from quite a distance away. Then how do you get that? Now again, coming back to the Talmud, there's an interesting ruling about ownership of a slave that is quite revealing. This: if somebody bought a slave from a Gentile, he does not agree to circumcision, the new master may attend to his persuasion for 12 months, and if he remain adamant, he should be sold to a non-Jew. So basically, if the slave is unwilling to convert to Judaism, you don't force him, you sell him to a Gentile who's not going to be bothered about that. But the Rabbi Simon Belazar said, in a town on the border, he, that's the slave, should not be kept at all, since he could pass on to his kinsman matter he had heard. So that's why somebody who is a slave from the community that's deciding to raid is a potential source of information. Obviously, if he runs away, then he can bring all sorts of information with him. But also, if he just can be talked to. Now, there is an emphasis on a link between trade and raiding and warfare, and it comes back to going back to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that perception that if people turn up in ships, whether it's the Phoenicians, whether it's Greeks, you never quite know whether they're going to try and sell you something, or whether if they get the chance they'll abduct a few of your youngsters to sell as slaves, or they might even launch a full raid and rob you, enslave you, steal your property. Because you don't know. And merchants will go back to their home communities, and part of their trading, part of their livelihood is also trading information to others. They will say to people, there's a nice village here, and there's a farm here, or this villa is particularly wealthy, or nearby there is a temple that has lots of treasures dedicated within its precinct. You need to know about these things. The likely targets are the farms, the settlements. The very large settlements are only accessible if you've got a lot of people in your raiding band to take them on. So you have to find something that is suitable, that is manageable for you in scale to attack, that doesn't have too many occupants, particularly too many that are able to fight, but also has sufficient occupants to capture and enslave, if that's what you're going for, sufficient wealth to steal, if that's what you're going for, cattle or sheep or whatever other forms of plunder that you can take and steal and take back with you. Things of value to you that make this raid worthwhile, make these risks worthwhile. So you have to go and know about those things. And that isn't obvious information. And the more you know, the better. If you know that there are likely to be lots of people there at one time, but fewer at another time of year, then maybe you go when there are fewer. All of this is important. And a lot of it comes, there's that trading link. It is very striking that Tacitus singles out one Germanic tribe as being allowed to come beyond the border posts, trading posts of the Roman Empire, actually into communities within the provinces to trade. And there tends to be regulation in quite a lot of treaties, not simply with the disorganized, the loosely structured, politically tribal peoples of around the empire's borders, but also even with the Sasanian Persians later on, you will have this stipulation that trade will only be conducted through a particular named city, because you don't want too many people wandering around your community, having a look at what's there, and then going back home and telling people, well, there's this really juicy and wealthy villa just up this little quiet valley, and nobody else is close by, so they won't hear what's going on, and this is a great place to raid and steal. The same, of course, applies to the Romans. If they're launching a raid as a punitive expedition, if they're attacking into enemy territory, for whatever reason, but particularly with raiding, you want to be able to go in, hit something that's worth hitting, or steal something that's worth stealing, or kill or capture people who are worth killing or capturing, and then get out. So you need to know where to go. The idea you sometimes get from the movies, whether it's Viking longships that just come out of the mist and stumble across the fishing village and slaughter everybody, or the monastery, or the Apaches or the Comanches turning up in a western to raid a ranch or a farm. Groups like this are successful because they're clever about what they're doing. They find out as much information as they can, because the more time you spend wandering around looking for things, the more chance is that you will run into defenders, and there might be more of them than you can handle, as the Chatti found in that quote we looked at a little while ago. Now, Ammianus again tells us from the 4th century of the Romans, where the unattached tribune Horotarius, thoroughly acquainted with the languages of the savages, is sent on a diplomatic mission to find out what the tribes were planning, but also to spy out the land. He achieves this, and the Roman army is able to concentrate and attack suddenly and know where it's going. So you can gather information through diplomacy, and that's another aspect that everybody's doing, whatever they say about it, and everyone's aware of this. There are, again, you can go back to something I cover in Rome and Persia, very clear rules for when Persian ambassadors come into Roman territory as to how many attendants they can have, so they're not sneaking in a raiding band under cover of a diplomatic mission, but also where they can go and where they can stop, because you don't want to let them get too much information about your defences. And exactly the same applies. The Persians will be doing the same thing when the Romans come to them. One way also you can get information is from captives, by talking to people from within those communities. So in 358 AD, again we're in Ammianus, Julian sends some officers out to capture a prisoner from the Alemanni. And a young Alaman was seized, led in on the condition of having his life spared. He promised to show them the way. Again, you need to know not just your targets, but how to get there. What are the routes? Are there rivers you've got to cross? And if so, how difficult are they to cross? You know, is this something that needs a boat, needs a ford, needs a bridge if it's really big? And if so, how safe is that? He led them, the army followed, prevented from going forward by a barricade of tall felled trees. When they finally, by long and circuitous detours, reached the spot, every man in the army, wild with anger, joined in setting the fields on fire, raiding flocks and men. If they resisted, butchered them without compunction. And this devastation prompts the king of the local tribe to seek peace. So again, you're looking at raiding extending into larger scale warfare. I mean, these are big raids the Romans are launching, but by intimidating the enemy, they're not fighting a pitched battle. They convince the enemy to give in. They make the enemy frightened of the Romans. And this intimidation, this balance of fear works both ways and is very common. It's there again and again on all sides. So let's think, this is another interesting incident from Caesar from 53 BC, if we go back earlier, who talks about a raid. Now, this is partly a passage where he's excusing some of his rather less good decisions that has led to a near disaster, but nevertheless, he's punishing the Eburones, the tribe that have destroyed Cotta and Sabinus' legion and a half and besieged Cicero. Now, I'll only, again, skim through this and read the highlighted bits. Basically, across the Rhine, the report reached the Germans the Eburones were being pillaged because Julius Caesar has declared that anybody who wants to can attack this tribe. He wants them punished. Nay, more, they were all invited to come and plunder. So 2,000 horsemen from the Sugambri get together, boats and rafts, they cross the Rhine 30 miles below the spot where the bridge had been built, garrison left by Caesar. Coming first to the borders of the Eburones, they caught many persons scattered in flight, captured a great quantity of cattle, of which barbarians are very covetous. But they learned from prisoners that Caesar and the main Roman army is some distance away. One of the prisoners said, "Why do you pursue this miserable and slender booty when you now have the chance of the utmost fortune?" And directs them to Atuatuca, where the Roman army has concentrated all its stores, its wealth. The garrison's so small, can't man the walls, no one dares to step outside the entrenchments. With this hope offered them, the Germans left in a secret place the plunder they'd got so far, and made for Atuatuca, using by guide the very man by whose information they had learnt the news. So here you've got a case where a group of raiders has come to raid a Gallic tribe, but then when they capture one of these, having done quite well, thank you very much, with some cattle, somebody says, look, there's even better plunder over there, and you don't like the Romans anyway, you've just, any more than you like or dislike us. They're vulnerable. Comes back to this idea. There's a prize waiting to be plucked over there, and you're brave warriors who are the men to do it. So they decide to change their mind. They put into some sort of they hide according to Caesar, but presumably if it's cattle, they're leaving men to look after them as well, and then the main body goes off to attack the Roman garrison. It doesn't go well for them, even after an initial success, but nevertheless, this is an idea where you've gathered some intelligence, you've heard about something worth plundering, and then you learn en route of something else, change your plan, and in fact, it doesn't quite work out for you. So you have, again, it's this picture of vulnerability, which comes back, it's another aspect of intelligence. What are the risks involved? Can I get in safely and get home again? Or are there lots of angry locals? Or is there a big Roman army or a big tribal army that's going to gather that will punish me if I don't get out really smartish? Now, in AD 68, when the Romans were in the midst of their civil war, the one that followed the death of Nero, the Roxolani, some of the Sarmatians, massacred a couple of cohorts. They 9,000 of them, according to Tacitus, crossed the Danube into the Roman province, but their success made them more intent on booty than on fighting. Consequently, when they were straggling and off their guard, the 3rd Legion with some auxiliary troops suddenly attacked them. On the Roman side, everything was ready for battle. The Sarmatians are massacred, defeated, they lose a lot of their plunder, lots of the lives of their warriors. Now that's a case where the intelligence is a Roman army has arrived they didn't really know about, because it's part of the moving towards Italy for the Roman Civil War. So again, comes back to intelligence. You need to know what's there. What are the dangers? What are the risks? What are the permanent garrisons? What might turn up? And how strong are the defensives? Where are the most vulnerable spots? And what's the balance between what you know is a risk, but what you're likely to achieve and will bring you more fame and glory as a warrior? So that's how the ticking clock starts. After that, we move on to the question of surprise. Again, it comes back to the analogy with the air raid, or indeed any attack. If the defenders are waiting for you, then your job is going to be that much harder, and you're going to have to fight regular warfare, perhaps a full-scale battle to get through them, which isn't really something you want to do. Again, we come back to this idea. This raid is mounted by people who want to achieve some success, get some plunder, but they don't plan on dying. There may occasionally, very rarely in history, have been groups who were determined to do damage to the enemy they hated and then die in the process. But overall, the overwhelming majority of raiders are there to go in, get some glory, and come out again. These warrior societies praise courage, praise prowess, and they will celebrate a heroic death, but they also don't plan on having them all the time. The idea is, particularly for the chieftains involved, this is a prestige thing. For those taking part, it adds to their glory and there's some tangible benefit. But you can only have those benefits if you get home. So if you're like the group of chatty that celebrate and get drunk and then get surprised by the Romans, or the others that choose to fight a Roman army and are defeated, then yes, you've shown how brave you are, but you've also lost. The purpose of the raid has failed. So you need that surprise because you don't want to make it harder for yourself than is possible. And ideally, for most of the groups, most of the time, you want to go in, do as little fighting with trained, well-equipped, numerous soldiers as possible, and then come home with the slaves, with the cattle, with the plunder, and with the prestige. So you want to make it as easy as possible. You know, this is not something where it's all about direct confrontation, if you can possibly avoid it. So you're dealing with stealth with speed, particularly with the smaller groups and the smaller raids that are involved. Surprise is something that is a big advantage to you, and you have it when you start off. Because in most cases, the defenders, whether they're the Romans or whether they're a tribal group, won't know you're coming. They won't be prepared. They won't be waiting. But you can't rely on that situation lasting for so long. Now, again, go back to Caesar, or in this case, the Book 8 of the Gallic Wars is written not by Caesar himself, but by one of his officers, Hirtius. And he talks about Caesar making a large-scale attack. Now, this is sort of plundering attack. It's vastatio, laying waste to the tribal territory. So it's a very big raid, bigger than most of what we're talking about. And how he catches the Gauls by surprise, many of them tilling their farms without the least fear, caught by the cavalry, the fast-moving Roman horsemen ahead of their army, before they could flee for refuge into the strongholds. For even the ordinary sign of a hostile inroad, which is usually perceived by the wholesale burning of farm buildings, had been omitted by Caesar's command, in order that his supply of forage and corn might not run short, which to advance further, and not to frighten the enemy. So he's not burning crops and things because he wants them, but also he's trying to surprise the enemy. Now, a small band of raiders is not likely to want to do this because they announce their presence by burning things. So as soon as they find something that's worth attacking, they are beginning to declare themselves. And there is a danger of them being spotted in the first place. Now, if we think about Hadrian's Wall, obviously this is a very serious danger. This is an obstacle you have to get past. It's also true with other lines of Roman frontier defences. So these are not necessarily there to stop you crossing, because in the end you can probably, with a small group, get across even a linear obstacle like Hadrian's Wall somewhere. The odds are there won't be too many soldiers at any one spot, that even if they see you, and if you go at night maybe they won't even see you, you can sneak across. If there aren't very many of you, and if you've got ladder, rope, something like that to get across. Of course, if you've got horses, ponies, anything like that, you're not going to be able to get those across the wall secretly, which means you need to secure one of the crossing points, one of the gateways through a mile castle or elsewhere. And that's immediately more of a challenge. So right from the start, something like that has made it harder for mounted raiders to cross that line. It's been marked. And even with other lines of defences, one of the other things about them, Hadrian's Wall has its turrets, you get the lines of towers like or small outposts like the Burgi that Commodus was recorded building on those inscriptions we looked at earlier. Watchtowers, very familiar feature on many Roman frontier areas, but also within other communities. People up on those have a raised platform. If you're moving in daylight and there isn't fog or something like that, then the chances of your being seen are significantly higher. Once you are seen, if those people can report, whether by blowing a horn, ringing a bell, galloping off as a messenger, or running with word that something has happened, you are starting to lose surprise. So you try to avoid going through these heavily defended areas. If you do, you go through them with great care, as stealthily as possible, unless you are convinced that the Romans don't have people manning them, there aren't defenders, therefore there's nobody looking, or there's nobody to come and bring help if they do send for it. Now, again, let's have a look. This is coming to Apuleius, the Metamorphoses, one of these novels from the Roman period. People would tend to be suspicious of travellers they didn't know. And in this case, a group of travellers are advised to journey with care and only in daylight because there's a threat of wolves. And herdsmen and animals travel together in a compact group and well armed for their own protection because this is dangerous country. However, because they're travelling like that, the workers on an estate, which we happened to pass, assumed from our numbers that we were a band of robbers, and being worried about their possessions and extremely frightened, they set dogs on us. They were mad, enormous creatures, fiercer than any wolf or bear, and they'd been carefully trained for guard duty. Suddenly, this great danger was followed by even worse trouble. From the rooftops and hill nearby, the farmers furiously began to hurl rocks down on us. So this shows where the locals, people on a big estate, are just suspicious of anyone they don't know, particularly anyone who looks armed and potentially dangerous, and therefore react in a hostile manner. So surprise is something that can very quickly and very easily be lost. And that adds to the ticking clock element, because once you have been spotted, particularly if it's by someone able to give the alarm, then things get more and more difficult. Now, we've already come across the ram's horn trumpet used in some Jewish settlements to give the alarm at the sight of raiders. You get similar impressions from other communities in different parts of the Greco-Roman world. And if we look at Cicero's Verrine orations, now in this case he's talking about plundering and looting expeditions organized by the Roman governor of Sicily, Verres, but he talks about the temple of Chrysos, a local river god at Asorus in Sicily. And because it's famous and prestigious, Verres doesn't demand the gold and treasures from it, but he arranges for a band of armed men by two of his employees who go in at night to break into the temple. The keepers and guards of the temple had timely warning of their coming. A signal well known to the neighbourhood was sounded on a cow horn. A crowd gathered from the surrounding farms, and the robbers, the band, are attacked and put to flight. Now this, probably they're not using formal military weapons in this case on either side, but here you have a situation where somebody's trying to rob a temple. The guards on the temple sound the alarm by, again, a cow horn in this case. Everybody gathers, there's danger, there's robbers, they gather with whatever weapons they've got, whatever they can improvise, they attack and drive off the robbers. Now, we can see this, it's obviously very natural if Roman troops are in the area and somebody spots a band of raiders, the alarm is going to go out, those Roman troops will organize some form of response. But we also need to remember, like the workers on the estate in Apuleius, like the local inhabitants, the farmers nearby here in Sicily, that other locals might gather. They don't want to be robbed. So as Caesar put it before, or Caesar's officer, they might, if the alarm comes in that case because of signs of burning, noise from and smoke from attackers, if the alarm goes out, people might go to a place of refuge and they might take their valuables, anything they can move, including cattle, and hide somewhere, or go behind walls, go behind somewhere that will be more difficult to take if they have warning. They might also gather in numbers, and if you don't look too formidable, they might decide to fight as well. Now again, we come back to the situation where a group of armed warriors, the half troop of some chieftain, plus lots of highly motivated people, might on balance be a better fighting force than a group of farm labourers, than a group of farmers, herdsmen, whoever they might be. But if they have to fight, it will take them more time, which means that the alarm can go further. If they have to fight, some of them might get hurt, and they'd really prefer not to do that. The best raid is one like the best robbery that comes completely by surprise, and you can kill at will with an enemy that's unprepared, is not waiting for you. So alarms that go up, whatever their situation, make that more difficult. Now, there's another situation from the Verrine orations where, again, another temple, this one of Hercules at Agrigentum, where an armed body of slaves are sent by one of the same leaders that Verres employs, descend on the temple again late at night. the Roman governor's actually in the town. The watchmen and the guards at first did their best to resist and repel the attack, but they're knocked about with clubs and cudgels. So it's not edged weapons, it's a sort of stage down from full-scale warfare. But the attackers break down the doors and try to pull the statue free from the pedestal. Meanwhile, shouts of alarm had informed the whole town that an assault was being made on their ancestral gods. No unforeseen invasion by an enemy or surprise attack by pirates, but a company of armed criminals come from the governor's house. Not a man in Agrigentum that night so old or infirm that he did not get out of his bed when news aroused him and lay hold of the first weapon that came to hand, so that in a short time there was a rush to the temple from all parts of the town. It takes about an hour, and then the crowds mass and the raiders flee. So, you have this situation of warning can gather populations. Populations are not necessarily defenseless. It depends on the scale of the threat they're facing, which means that, again, depending on the size of the raiding band, they've got to be very careful what they try to attack and what risks they take, because even a group of semi-armed civilians can pose problems. So again, it's all part of the calculation that the leaders have to make as to where they go, and they need more information to do that. But time is not on their side. Once they are revealed, then the odds are some sort of response will come. In any normal situation, where there isn't a civil war, where the garrison hasn't been stripped away, not only will locals either hide themselves and their goods so you can't steal them and you can't kill them, or they will fight back. And again, you don't want to take casualties, because it's like Viking bands, it's like Comanches or anyone like that. The warriors in these groups are valuable, and they are not easily replaced. They are not soldiers where you can just go and conscript and train some more or recruit some more, and they're not part of a huge army. They are a relatively small group, and too many heavy losses too often are starting to shift the balance between this being a successful raid and this being a failure. So we go back to Apuleius, because there's an interesting story here whereby, again, it's a story told by a character who's pretending to be somebody else, so it's by its nature fictional, but it's also meant to be plausible, to be convincing. And he talks about this character pretends to be a robber and tells this story of how he broke into a little inn by the shore late at night, but where by chance an imperial procurator who'd lost favour and been sent to this out-of-the-way place, and his wife and his entourage was sleeping. They steal everything, but we ran into serious danger before we got away. The moment the procurator's wife heard the sound of the door, the wife ran into the room, stirred up the whole place with repeated shouts. She calls the soldiers and her servants by name. She rouses everybody. It's the woman of the family who sorts them out, but raises everyone. There are some troops, so there's a bodyguard element. There are servants, these are armed, and they only escape from this suddenly rather more formidable prospect than they'd expected, because everyone's confused and a lot of them stayed hidden and didn't come out, so they got away. However, he's made a mistake. He attacked an inn that looked vulnerable, but in fact there's a Roman official and his wife there, and the wife, who is clearly presented in the story as a far more formidable character than her husband, she appeals to Caesar, to the emperor, who acted. Caesar banned the guild, the collegium of Hymus the robber. That's the character this fellow's invented, pretending to be the band, we should say. And it disappeared forthwith. Such is the power of even a nod from a great prince. His entire band had been hunted out, cornered, cut down by regiments of soldiers, vexillationium militarium, so that's detachments of soldiers rather than formed units. I alone got away, dresses up as a woman and rides a donkey to get past the patrols. Now, curiously enough, from the same sort of region where the novel's set, there's an inscription from 176, around about then, so again, roughly contemporary with Apuleius, where a vexillation is taken from the legions in Moesia and sent under a Marcus Valerius Maximus as praepositus, acting commander, to deal with or dislodge a band of Thracian brigands in the area. And we know from that man's career inscription. So it's quite interesting that you actually have a real life example of the sort of story that this character pretending to be Hymus the bandit is telling, where the Romans have decided this is actually a problem and they commit troops, and then a relatively small group of bandits is in serious trouble. It's not their job. They're not being paid enough, they're not earning enough, they're not stealing enough to go toe-to-toe with the Roman army. So when it comes in strength, they're in serious trouble. And that's true of any raiding band. The Chatti who were caught, and some of them are massacred whilst drunk, whilst they're passed out, the other group try and fight, but they are defeated by regular, well-armed, well-led Roman troops. That's the big risk. The odds are the defenders can mass more people or more effective soldiers than you've got, so with greater fighting capacity. Therefore, if you lose surprise, once the warning's gone out, once help starts to arrive, defenders start to muster, then everything gets more and more dangerous for you, more and more difficult for you. So if you're looking at one of the frontier areas where there are Roman forts, Roman outposts, you can see this network. The outposts, the watchtowers, the turrets, the small fortlets, whatever they might be, are the tripwire. They're the warning, they're the closed-circuit cameras that reveal the presence of raiders, of a threat, and then send that information to somewhere where there is a larger number of troops who might be able to deal with it. Now, if it's a very small band of just, a handful of men, then maybe a fortlet itself can deal with them. Go back to the Egyptian case, that outpost on the Red Sea Road, were small numbers, but they had fought back, and they do chase after the barbarians after they've left with their captives and plunder. So some of this can be very small scale, it can be dealt with, and you can see even the garrison of half a dozen men or so in a turret might deal with a couple of raiders, or might try to, but they're probably not going to try and deal with 20 or 30 or 50. So that sort of thing. The first information that can go out could be horn blowing, a smoke signal, flags waved, that could be very simple and seen over, particularly the smoke, over a long distance. That could be simply danger. Someone's afield, there's enemy out there, there's a threat out there, at which point everyone starts to prepare. Now, we don't know the routine of Roman garrisons, to what extent, yes, there'd be sentries, but to what extent you would have groups of men who could be made ready to move and take the field, even if only over a short distance, in so many hours. To what extent are you always prepared? It's going to depend on the circumstances of that region, what the perceived threat is, what the level of activity is of the commanders of garrisons, and what other duties they've got to do. So where this comes in their list of priorities. But in many cases where there's a serious danger, and in frontier systems like Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall, even the unconnected areas on other frontiers, then you have garrisons that presumably have men who can be made ready fairly quickly. And obviously the ones who can respond the fastest in most circumstances will be cavalrymen. It's again another sign of the usefulness of the cohortes equitatae, where you've got at least a small number of horsemen there. And if you've got horsemen in mile castles, in fortlets, they can carry a message and report an incursion much quicker than somebody on foot. Now, you might also be doing, if the alarm has gone up, you go and you send out a patrol to try and find out who's out there, how many there are, what the danger is, work out where they're going. So all of this takes time. You don't imagine an instant response, because the Romans, again, they're like a police force today. They're not expecting, they don't know a crime is going to be committed at 2:30 in the morning in this particular house, so that they can be waiting for it. They have to wait to see the report, they see what's going on, then they respond, and they're planning for all sorts of other contingencies. Because again, the big advantage the attackers have, they can choose where and when they attack. The defenders don't know that, they've just got to wait, perhaps gather intelligence, hope to hear about these things, but the odds are, unless it's a really big raid, they're not going to hear about it until it's already in their territory. So all of these things are balanced, but gradually it's sand running out of the timer for the raiders, because unless they're confident enough that they can defeat any Roman force that can be brought against them, then they have to think about leaving. They have to get away without fighting the Romans. But of course they've come for a reason, and one of those reasons, one of the main ones, is plunder. So that comes back to intelligence. Where are you going? If you're just relying on hopefully stumbling across someone, well, that maybe might work on a busy road sometimes, but it's very risky, and what if no one turns up? Again, reputation is important. People are not going to keep on following a leader that leads you nowhere and gets no plunder. So it comes back to having identifiable targets, things you know about and you know how to get there. Once you're there, then you've got to actually take the plunder. Now that might mean fighting the family that runs their farm, or the extended family group, or the household of a villa, the slaves there, the herdsmen, the workers, who might choose to resist you if they haven't escaped. Now maybe you can take them by surprise, but maybe they bolt the doors and hole up inside. What do? Do you burn the place down to try and get them out? Do you launch a full-scale attack? Do you take the risk of casualties? Do you also spend the time this will take to steal things? And this is a reminder of how things we don't necessarily see as defensive, as fortifications, are actually rather important. So many villas, particularly the later period grand villas you get in Roman Britain, often have what looks like a tower. And this is conventionally written off, well, of course it's not defensive, it's just so the great man can go out and look on his estates and survey them. And that may be true, but it's also somewhere where someone can be and they can see any sign of trouble out in your fields. They can see your workmen galloping back quickly to get to the main house. You know, it's a viewing platform, pure and simple. It's like going up to the top of your house to look out of your highest window to see what's going on. That's important. If you have gateways, they're not going to resist an army with a battering ram, but they can slow down a gang of raiders. If you've got high walls, again, people have got to climb over them. And it's the same even with the ditch that might surround a little farmstead of roundhouses. It's to stop your animals straying, but it also makes it far more difficult for anybody other than you to get those animals out, because the only way in and out for them is probably going to be that one entrance way. So if somebody comes at night and while you're all asleep tries to steal the couple of cows you've got or your pigs or whatever it might be, they've got to sneak in without you noticing, and then they've got to sneak those animals out without you noticing. If there's lots of them, again, maybe they can fight, but again, if there's warning, everything is harder for them. Or you might, if you've got enough warning, you might have skedaddled out with everything you can drive off. So again, things that are not defensive or fortifications in a strictly military sense in large-scale warfare are significant in this context of raiding, where the line blurs with robbery, and where it's just important that you have something to slow them down. It's a little bit like having a lock on your front door. It is not going to stop an assault by a platoon of paratroops, but it will make it more difficult for a burglar to break in without making noise and revealing his presence, which might trip an alarm, might wake you up, might allow you to give the alarm, might allow you to respond to raise the house. You've got to think in those terms. This is a different sort of world. Gathering plunder took time. It might involve dispersal, particularly for a large band. Even for a small group, you have to find what you've come to steal, to take. You have to secure it in the case of animals, in the case of human beings. You might have to fight sometimes to get them. And then you've got to bring it together and move it and transport it back home. Otherwise, the purpose of the expedition becomes rather pointless, because you've lost anything you've taken and you've lost the prestige with it. So once you get to the area as a group of raiders, there are all sorts of tasks that require you to spend more time. And depending on the situation, you don't necessarily know how much time you've got. It comes back to this race against the clock, because you've got to assume that the Romans, or whoever the defenders are gathering, and they are going to do something about this incursion into their territory. And in most cases, you've raided not in superior force to the enemy army, should they muster it, or the main host of the tribal, all the war bands gather together, all the warriors turned out, if it's Romans attacking a tribal people or one tribe attacking another. You give them time to react, you give them time to find you, and you give them time to strike. Now, we've already mentioned the incident where the group of the Chatti get caught whilst drunk, and then I mentioned something from Ammianus. Let's just look at that passage in a little bit more detail. This is from 366, where Jovinus learnt from a faithful scouting party the group of plunderers, having laid waste the nearby villas, was resting by a river. Coming closer and hidden in a valley made obscure by the thick growth of trees, he saw some bathing, some colouring their hair red, as was their custom, and others drinking, and taking advantage, he immediately gave the signal by horn and attacked the bandits' camp and wipes them out, or at least defeats them to the point where they surrender, and they're at his mercy. And as is often the case in the later Roman Empire, you start recruiting people rather than necessarily killing them all or enslaving them all, as you might have done in earlier periods. So you become vulnerable, and it's quite striking that they are surprised. This is a group of raiders that have relied upon surprise, on speed of movement, for the success of their expedition. They've gone into Roman territory, the Romans didn't know they were there, they've used surprise, they've used concealment, they've used speed. The Romans, countering them, use exactly the same techniques and exactly the same methods to catch them and defeat and destroy them. Now, again, we could look at going back to Caesar, where in 53 BC, and again, it's this incident, it precedes the bit where the Germanic tribesmen cross the Rhine and go to start plundering their barones and then decide that actually, let's go and plunder the Romans instead, because they seem to be offering a better opportunity. So again, this is why Caesar takes this decision in the first place, why he doesn't want to risk his own army to go and to ravage, to plunder, to capture, to destroy, to kill the Eburones as punishment, because there's no definite body of troops, any stronghold, any garrison. Population was scattered in all directions. Each man had settled where a hidden valley or a wooded locality offered some hope of defence or security. These localities were known to the dwellers round about, and thus the matter required great care, not for the protection of the army as a whole, but for the preservation of individual soldiers, for the passion for plunder was apt to draw many men too far afield. So, reluctant to risk his own men, Caesar sent messengers round to the neighbouring states and invited them in the hope of booty to join him in pillaging the Eburones, and that's what prompts those Germans, among others, to come and do that. This is something that applied to both sides. Dispersing, to plunder, to ravage does mean dispersal, does mean that you are vulnerable. You are not ready to fight an organised enemy who turns up in any sort of strength. And again, strength is relative. If this is a band of 20, 30, 40, 50 warriors, then the appearance of 30 or 40 Roman soldiers in a group is a pretty devastating threat. And this is something, if you get larger, then obviously it's bigger forces involved. And that lure to plunder, which is common in many armies in many periods, whether they need food and resources just to supply themselves in the field or the hope of gain, is something that is frequently used as a basis for an ambush. So we read in Tacitus of some auxiliary cohorts that are ambushed by the Silures of southern Wales because they're lured on in the hope of plunder. There are descriptions of this in 2nd century BC in Iberia in that time. So you could be lured. Roman troops are sometimes lured into ambush by the hope of gain. So are other raiders and people of anybody. So it's a major risk. So once you've gathered all that plunder, assuming you've managed to do this, you've got everything together, you've done what you came for, you've killed, you've perhaps committed all sorts of unpleasant atrocities by modern standards, but that's the nature of warfare and violence in the ancient period. You've gathered cattle, you've gathered sheep, you've piled up the wagons full of any shiny object you could find, anything useful, anything metal, anything valuable, and perhaps if you're really lucky, gold and silver and all those things. You've then got to transport them. They are very, very bulky. If they're human beings you've taken as slaves, then they need to be guarded because they're not likely to be keen on the idea of this enslavement, so they might try and escape. They might, in certain circumstances, fight back. So we have this relief from Mainz of 2 chained naked captives from a Roman monument. If you look at the Adam Clissi monument that I've talked about in another video, and I'll spend some time on in the future, you have these depictions of women and children that appear to be amongst the captives taken by the Roman army in their victory over a migrating or raiding or invading group of various types of tribal peoples. You see them earlier on in the monument, assuming that's the order of the things, arriving in a wagon. Now, people who've brought all their goods, that's great, but then you've got to get them home. So you've come whatever distance it is, into hostile territory, into the Roman provinces, or from the Roman point of view, into tribal or foreign areas beyond the frontiers. You've then got to get all this plunder back. Now, given that you can move in relatively quickly because you're unencumbered when you attack, and you have the surprise on your side, by now, if the enemy haven't gathered to fight you already, they will very, very soon. So you've got to move quickly, but the problem is you can't move quickly because you've laden yourselves down with all these prisoners, with all this plunder, with all these wagons full of booty, and it makes a difference to how you can travel. A small body of men, perhaps even a small body of horsemen, can swim or ford rivers and streams that would be far more difficult, if not impossible, for you to take a wagon across, or even for you to take captives that might well include women and children. These tended to be high value slaves, because you could either absorb them into your community. Taking a lot of strong young men as slaves was always a great risk because they might choose to turn against you. They can fight back. You take the vulnerable, and then you've got to get them home, and you've got to face the weather. You've got to face the routes back. So you might be channeled into following proper tracks, perhaps even roads, because that's the only way you can transport a lot of your plunder, a lot of the stuff you've taken. And you're facing the weather. So, in other periods of history, we hear about raiding happening at certain times of year. For instance, before the cattle go to winter pastures, when they're still fat from the summer and before the ground gets too waterlogged, too wet, too muddy to slow down movement. Similar situations probably existed depending on the conditions in various parts of the empire. So now you've got the ticking clock, the final stage. This is getting home, and getting home without being caught by the Romans or whoever else has pursued you. And if you think about all the things we talked about as the frontier defences, whether it's the depopulated strip of land around tribal territory that Caesar talks about, the big thick thorn hedges that he talks about with the Belgic tribes, that they hedge their territory around. It's almost a marker, a warning to people that if you step beyond this point, then we will fight you, and we are dangerous, violent people who will sort you out. You need to be frightened of us, so don't do it. It's basically keep off my land. That's the symbol. And it's probably no coincidence that Caesar's army runs into a Belgic army as it's crossing these boundaries into their territory. But we've also got, think back to Hadrian's Wall, to the turrets, to the garrisons, to all the system, perhaps a linear boundary, which is going to be very, very difficult for you to get across if you do have wagons full of plunder, if you do have livestock. Again, you can't easily carry a horse and haul it up over Hadrian's Wall to the other side. You can have even more trouble with cattle, with sheep, with human captives as well, who might not be so agile to climb a rope or a rope ladder, and certainly are going to be less stealthy. You've also got rivers are a major factor within this for any sort of substantial booty. So you're looking at, you've got to find a bridge, or you've got to find a ferry, or some crossing place if there is a major obstacle of that sort. Think back again to the example of the wagon full of plunder that had sunk in the Rhine in the 3rd century, and that several of these have been found. This is difficult. You're facing these physical obstacles, all of which is slowing you down. And it is striking that again and again and again in our sources, any attacker, anybody who raids into enemy territory, is most likely to meet major resistance on their way home. So this is true whether it's raiders coming into the Roman territory like the Chatti earlier on, whether it's a Roman army penetrating, if you look at the campaigns of Germanicus as they go east beyond the Rhine into hostile territory, they are nearly always confronted by a tribal army when they've turned and they're on their way back. Now, there are several reasons for this, and the time is the main one. It takes time for the alarm to go up. It takes time then, once the alarm has gone out, for everybody to gather, for everybody to arm, for an army to muster. Roman troops, depending on the situation, depending on the distribution of garrisons, their state of readiness, perhaps can be a little bit quicker, but tribal armies as well, they've got to do this. They've got to gather with sufficient food supplies to keep them in the field for a few days. But they have the advantage that at this stage, they tend to know where the enemy are, and they can also predict which way they'll have to go home. Because in most cases, any substantial force or any force that's gathered large amounts of plunder, you can predict the tracks it will have to follow, the routes it will have to follow, and therefore it's very common for an army to come and position itself blocking the route home. And there you have to fight a battle to get through them before you can continue. And think of that 3rd century site in the Hartshorn in Germany, where again it looks like a Roman expedition that's gone east, has turned back west and is attacking from east to west against a position held by local tribes and fights its way through. The pattern is there again and again and again, and it doesn't matter who you are, who's attacking and who's defending, nearly always your greatest danger is on the way home. So that's a big, big problem, and we read of difficulties as armies are retreating, and very often barbarian groups in particular tend to get surprised by the Romans when they're laden down with plunder. Sometimes when they're not ready at all, they're drinking and lazing around and dyeing their hair red by the river, or they've all got drunk and debauched themselves like the Chatti earlier on. But other cases, they are simply slow, they are vulnerable. So getting home is just as important as any other stage in the raiding process, because again, we come back to what we've said before. These raiders in the main are not out on a suicide mission. They don't want to go cause mayhem, kill, destroy, mutilate, mistreat, just to show the enemy that they hate them and they want to destroy them. These are people who wish to go, they wish to win glory, they wish to humiliate the enemy, but they also wish to profit. And all of that requires getting back home, and getting back home with as much of your plunder as you can hold on to, and also as many of your people as you can. To be a successful leader of these sorts of raids, you don't want the reputation of someone who gets nearly everybody killed and loses most of the spoils that they've taken. You want to be a success story. You want to be able to tell people, come with me, not only will you live, but you'll win great glory, great prizes. And therefore, I'm the man to follow. I'm a chieftain to note, to acknowledge, to accept, whose favor is worth seeking within the wider community of the tribe or whatever it might be. So that's the pattern. You go in and the chances are that very few defensive systems, even the most organized ones held by the Romans, can actually stop raiders as they're attacking, any more than go back to the early analogy of an air raid, it's quite hard to intercept the defenders all the time before they reach their targets. Sorry, not the defenders, the attackers. It's hard for the defenders to do that because you've got to guess right and you've got to position your people in time to be in the right place to meet them. But you know they've got to go home, and you can predict pretty clearly which way they're going to go, so you can marshal more forces to meet them then. So this is a pattern that we see. Raiders have a good chance of getting in, although when you look at the formidable nature of a structure like Hadrian's Wall, if it is properly manned, then you are making it very, very difficult indeed to launch any sort of small raid. You can maybe manage with just a few men sneaking across at night, but anything in between, anything involving a few dozen, let alone a few hundred, let alone a few thousand, is probably going to have to fight its way in from very early on, and the odds are that unless the Roman garrisons are severely depleted, then they will gather in sufficient strength to defeat and destroy you before you can really achieve anything, and certainly before you can get home. But in other respects, it's most likely that stage will happen. That big risk comes once you've penetrated, once you're starting to plunder, and then when you turn around and try and take everything home. And this is an extremely grim business. And we've only got to think back to those mutilated bodies and skulls at Regensburg. There's an account from a Sasanian expedition that's taken lots of civilians from the provinces captive, of them hamstringing those who couldn't keep up as they were retreating, because they didn't want to be slowed down to the pace of the oldest, the weakest, the most vulnerable. They couldn't be bothered to kill them. Perhaps they wanted to send a message to the Romans of just how big and bad and nasty and frightening they were, but also this element of cruelty. They just leave things there, leave these people dying, unable to move, and again thinking, well, perhaps that's going to slow the Romans down if they stop to help them. So this is a grim business, and it's a grim business whichever army is doing it. Roman raids and expeditions to punish or intimidate the tribes tend to be very brutal. Tribal raids into Roman territory tend to be very brutal, and it's true wherever you go in the empire. The ancient world was a grim, savage place. There are, however, degrees of this. Some groups are more savage than others, and there's an element in some of these cases where they are deliberately being as appalling as possible because they want to frighten the enemy. And that brings us on to our final stage, retribution. Because after all, a raid like this is something that if it succeeds, and sometimes they do, then the message goes out more widely that we are vulnerable. We have things worth taking and we're not strong enough to protect them. That if you are skillful and if you are brave and if you are bold, you might be able to get in, you might be able to attack us, you might be able to rob us. So one of the things that raids tend to spark, and it's one of the reasons why you can't separate this low-level military activity from the big battles, the big campaigns, the big wars, is that one can lead to the other. You can use this raiding within a wider conflict as a method, as a strategy to adopt at one period, as a way of harming your enemy, either because you can't harm him in battle because you're not strong enough, or because he's not willing to face you in battle and you can't force him to do that. But retribution. Romans mount a lot of punitive expeditions, they'd be called by 19th, early 20th century imperial standards, where you go out to punish, to frighten the communities beyond your frontier or within internal frontiers if they're in a lawless area, so that they will not do anything you don't want them to do. They'll stop raiding, they'll stop attacking, because the punishment they receive as a result of doing this is not worth the gain they will acquire from actually raiding. So this is a time of, there are from Hadrian's Wall, we've got the case from Vindlandia, you get evidence like this from Trajan's column, skulls mounted over the gateway of forts or on the ramparts. You can send messages that way. Obviously, the best way to deter raiders is to catch a reasonable number of them and punish them in some way or another, quite possibly in a fairly gruesome way. But make sure they don't get home with so that they can show off their plunder, so that they can boast of their glory, show off the herds, the captives, all of those things. You hear stories of tribal groups passing around captured Roman standards in Britain, in Gaul, this sort of thing, to show off marks of success. Look, the Romans aren't as strong as you thought they were, it's worth fighting them. So if you don't control this raiding, it can very easily spiral up into something else. And obviously if you're the recipient, you're bound to be pretty angry about this. So it comes back to the mix of intimidation as well as defensive measures, like the Germans having their strip of depopulated land around tribal territory. It's a warning sign. Don't mess with us. But you have to back that message up. And it's the same with the Romans. There's an element where visually frontier lines, whether it's a fixed one like Hadrian's Wall, or a continuous one rather, or the Antonine Wall, or whether it's the limes somewhere else, lots of watchtowers, lots of garrisons, soldiers appearing at various times. It's intimidating. And it's visually something that's a reminder the Romans are strong. Watchtowers in particular could serve this purpose. Even if there's nobody there, if you don't know whether someone's up there or not watching, and therefore able to send out a warning if they see you out and about doing things that the Romans don't like, then you've still got to be careful. Again, it's like closed-circuit television. There might not actually be film or the equivalent digitally in the camera. It might not be switched on, but if people think it is, they tend to modify their behavior accordingly and go somewhere else. Now, of course, one of the big problems with any defensive thing like this is if you defend one area very strongly, then people tend to move to another one which is perceived as more vulnerable. And you can see that in some campaigns. For instance, the conflicts against Tacfarinas in North Africa under Tiberius's reign. But the Romans and the barbarians would each seek to intimidate the other to prevent raiding like this. So you can negotiate, but you can also display your strength. You can go out and you can raid in return. Probably that's what it's going to mean. It's plundering, it's destroying communities, it's rounding up cattle, taking captives. Perhaps they'll come out and meet you in battle. Remember, we go back to that incident with Tacitus describes about the Chatti, where the Roman legatus was hoping he could provoke the tribe into a mass battle, but they don't bite. That would be a good symbol, that would be a good demonstration of Roman power and a glorious episode for the commander in question. On the other hand, if they submit without that being necessary, well, that's also good, if they've shown suitable humility. So let's just go back and look at an incident from 51 BC, where again, it's about retribution, where Cicero, the orator, no great soldier, but someone who's found himself as proconsular command in Cilicia, a couple of legions and various allies at his disposal, has formed an army to meet a feared Parthian attack. That hasn't happened. He's near the edge of his province with Syria, the boundary. He's near the area of Mount Amanus. It's rugged country that throughout, on and off, throughout the Roman period and before and afterwards, tended to encourage the mountaineers who lived there, the people who lived there, to raid a bit around the area if they could get away with it. So Cicero tries to fool them after pretending to go away from the mountain to other parts of Cilicia, marching away for a day. He sneaks back at night with the army in light marching order expedita, and on the 3rd of October is climbing Mount Amanus before first light the next day. Breaks up his formations, his cohorts and his auxiliaries. He's basically got 2 understrength legions plus auxiliary and allied troops, separate attacking parties, couple of columns, so 3 columns, and they move out. They surprise them because, again, it is striking how often people who, when they fight, rely on surprise, on stealth, on sudden appearance, will fall prey to exactly the same tactics used against them. So they storm several villages and they kill a large number of the enemies, storm the forts, burn them, mop-up operations for 4 days, and then he attacks this place called Pindenissum, a major town he describes it as, though again even he admits that nobody will have heard of this and it's not a famous place. And this is the next stage up, so it's escalating the type of warfare. I surrounded them by ditch and rampart, blockaded them by 6 forts and a large camp, assaulted them with an earthwork, mantlets and towers, and by bringing into play large numbers of siege engines and archers and a good deal of personal industry, I completed the operation on the 57th day, without any inconvenience or expense. Demolishes parts of the city, or most of the city, burns it down, and they surrender. And their neighbours were equally malignant and rebellious, but after he'd taken Pindenissum, oh dear, misprinted that, he took hostages from them. So they submit. So this is a display of Roman force and savagery, terror tactics in many respects, but that's how a lot of ancient warfare works. The Romans go in and the locals think, yes, it's not worth raiding them at the moment. But again, that attitude will change because this is not something that has given them any cause to love the Romans. They will remember the burning houses, they will remember the dead, they will remember the stolen cattle, all of this. So they will also think, well, we've raided in the past, once the Romans go away, once they're weaker, maybe we can get at it again. And then, at the end of the siege, Cicero has a festival, gives the spoils except for the horses, and captives sold. But things like this can go wrong because these are major campaigns with all the risks of major campaigns. So during the siege of Pindenissum, Bibulus, who's the proconsul of neighbouring Syria, he's also the man who's been consul with Caesar and shared various other offices and always been in Julius Caesar's shadow. Cicero reckons he was jealous of him, Cicero, so he attacks in exactly the same area, the same mountain areas, begins his task of looking for a bay leaf in a wedding cake. But instead, things go badly wrong. The whole of his first cohort was lost, as well as Asinius Dento, the primus pilus, and of noble stock, and the rest of the centurions of the same cohort, along with a military tribune, Sextus Lucilius, son of Titus Gavius Caepio, who has both wealth and position. It was really a mortifying reverse and inopportune. So the Romans under Cicero have demonstrated Roman might, Roman willingness to be savage, to be scary, to be frightening. And then along comes Bibulus, who tries to do the same thing, but makes mistakes, goes wrong. One detachment is ambushed. He loses most of the men and the officers of his first cohort. So all of this is about sending a message of strength and power. And in this case, you've sent 2. One that you're strong, followed very quickly by another one that actually the Romans don't know what they're doing and they can be beaten. It's all about maintaining an aura of invincibility. It comes back to the same idea that Caesar claimed the Germans expressed with their depopulated strip of land. It's all about reputation. It's symbols that show you we are tough, we are hard, don't mess with us, don't attack us, and beg and pray that we don't attack you. So you better be nice to us. And that's the same whether it's the Roman Empire dealing with tribal peoples and to a great extent with organized kingdoms, but also those kingdoms and those tribes in return with their attitude to the Romans. So it can all go horribly wrong in the same way that, think back to the First Anglo-Afghan War when you have the disastrous retreat from Kabul and the only European, only Dr. Burden gets back to the main British position, and famously so. And that's a message whereby that story of the weakness of the imperial power, of the disaster, of the massacre of their soldiers, that will be remembered. Particularly in these peoples where you have an oral culture. So songs can be just as fresh generation after generation. And it perhaps makes them more immediate because it's something your grandfather sang to you and it makes it more real than something you read in a history book, perhaps. So let's just look to finish at an episode from Tacfarinas and his war of resistance against the Romans in North Africa, or his career seeking his own ambitions, however you choose to look at it, in Tiberius's reign. And he was a Numidian by nationality. He'd been an auxiliary in the Roman camp, whether at a senior level as an officer, as was often the case with tribal leaders, we don't know. Though there's a piece of Roman snobbery that comes up again and again, the sense that all their most dangerous enemies were people that they'd taught themselves. So you learned how to fight with the Roman army, and that's what makes you so dangerous. You could say that about Sertorius, about Arminius, about Civilis, Spartacus even. There's a tradition that he had been served in the Roman army at one point. So Tacfarinas begins by recruiting gangs of vagrants accustomed to robbery for the purposes of plunder, and forms them into a military body, organizes them on the Roman pattern to some extent, and gets recognized by a group of people, the Musulami, and he allies with some of the Mauritanians, keeps his army concentrated whilst the others go off, the allies go and raid, and they disseminated fire, slaughter and terror, others forced to join them. But at that point, the Roman proconsul of North Africa, and of course this is that one province that for a while still has an army, a single legion in it most of the time, that's commanded by a senatorial proconsul rather than an imperial legate. And he's defeated. Tacfarinas risks a pitched battle with the Romans. It all goes horribly wrong. He gets beaten and routed, but he escapes along with some of his men. So after that, he changes his tactics because that clearly hasn't worked fighting en masse. So he goes back to desultory raids, too speedy for reprisals. But they build up his reputation and they build up the confidence of his men. They attract supporters. Then by the destruction of villages, by plunder on a larger scale. And then finally, he actually is bold enough to surround a Roman cohort that's garrisoned. And as is so often the case, the Roman cohort garrison comes out of its walls, led by its commander, tries to drive them off, but in fact the cohort panics, the commander's killed, and they run away, and they're, this is one of those times where clearly the unit, either this wasn't a very popular officer or a good leader, or there was something wrong with the unit and its morale, it lacked confidence, or they were badly led in other ways. We don't have many details. So again, Tacfarinas and his men are encouraged. The Roman survivors of that cohort decimated, one of the later examples of that punishment of executing 1 in 10. But when Tacfarinas moves on and assaults another garrison, another praesidium at Thala, then a group of veterans apparently, so presumably this is part of the legion, the veterans who are no longer obliged to perform fatigues and other duties but are still kept with the colours, so these are tough old sweats, they come out and they fight and they beat the Numidians off. So they lost heart at that and then think, well, sieges are a bad idea. So he falls back on, again, the translation that I'm using here uses guerrilla warfare, which is not in the Latin, and instead he explains that they yield ground when the Romans come close and press them and then harass them from the rear. Indeed, so long as the barbarians adhered to this strategy, he befooled with impunity the ineffective and footsore Romans. But when he deviated to the coastal district and encumbered himself with a train of booty which kept him near a fixed encampment, Apronius Caesianus, with cavalry and auxiliary cohorts reinforced by the most mobile of the legionaries, fought a successful engagement, chased the Numidians into the desert. So again, it's one of those problems. You move elsewhere to an area that's vulnerable and plunder that, but as you gather plunder, you've got to look after that plunder, you've got to protect it, you have a temporary base, you've then got to move it, it makes you vulnerable, the Romans can find you, they catch you. You can't run away and flee without abandoning your plunder, and therefore you're defeated again. So Tacfarinas clearly wanted more than simply plunder. He sends an embassy to Tiberius asking for territory for himself and his army. So again, it comes back to that idea we've had right at the start, that you plunder and you raid because you have to, because you don't have land to support your people, to raise families, to provide for them. Therefore, if you're given land, then you'll stop plundering. However, the Romans reject this. The new proconsul sent to hunt him down, and he forms 3 columns to chase the Numidians and Tacfarinas. In the centre, and with the flower of his troops, was the commander himself, who by securing appropriate positions with fortresses and entrenchments had rendered the whole district cramped and dangerous for his enemies. Turn where they would, they found some part of the Roman forces, on the front, on the flank, often in the rear, and numbers were destroyed or entrapped by these methods. So the Romans are broken up into 3 large columns, but they're also setting up bases, garrisons, fortified outposts at key points to make it difficult for the Numidians to move around freely without risking A, being seen by the Romans, who can then report to a larger force, or in the case of some of these garrisons, being harassed by the troops within them if they've got the strength to do it. However, The Numidians react. You can't catch all of them like this. They're still slipping through his grasp. So next, the Roman commander subdivided his tripartite army into yet more numerous detachments, headed by centurions of tested courage. You're breaking down into smaller detachments because that's the level of war you're having to fight against these enemies. Not even when summer was spent would he fall in with the custom by withdrawing his men and quartering them for a winter's rest. He arranged a chain of forts, flying columns of men familiar with the desert, kept hounding Tacfarinas from one desert camp to another, until at last, having captured Tacfarinas' brother, he returned. Too hastily, however. The Romans think they've defeated this threat. They think they've intimidated and killed enough that the Numidians under Tacfarinas won't be back to raiding. But in fact, there's still a lot of them out there, and the reasons why they're raiding in the first place still apply. So you've also dispersed a lot of your troops into small detachments, into little garrisons, which creates all sorts of problems. So the war continues, and Tacfarinas gains some allies more or less openly, and uses lightly armed bands whose numbers report magnified in proportion to the distance. From the province itself, every man of broken fortunes or turbulent character rushed to his standard with an alacrity all the greater, because the Romans who'd beefed up the the provincial army to 2 legions have now withdrawn one of them. 9th Hispana has gone away, so it's back to 1 legion plus auxiliaries, trying to deal with this, trying to cover this wide area. And the big problem is with defending lots of places, that ties up lots of your troops who are no longer mobile. And of course, can you garrison everywhere strongly enough so that there isn't another region that's vulnerable? So, and he besieges a town. You know, Tacfarinas is bold enough to do that. Now, the Roman proconsul Dolabella arrives, raises the siege, but again starts to occupy other posts, but that's requiring more and more men. And he tries to prevent other chieftains joining the enemy, forms 4 mobile columns this time, each under the command of a legate or a tribune, and led by local guides. It's a key feature of Roman warfare and many successful imperial powers. Get the locals to fight on your side, because they're the ones who really know the terrain. They know how to operate in it, and particularly when you're on the fringes of the desert in North Africa and you're in some rugged country, then you get the locals because they know how to live there, they know how to move there, they know how to track there, and they know their enemy as well. And in nearly every region, there are enough locals who dislike the people who happen to be fighting the Romans at the moment more than they dislike the Romans. So they see this as an opportunity to pursue their own ambitions, their own rivalries, their own vendettas. In the same way that go back to, you know, Geronimo and the Apaches were brought in by Apache scouts. And without those, the US Army would have had far more trouble actually bringing in that very small band that, again, whose numbers were magnified because they were very mobile, they were very clever, they moved around, they fought well and skillfully. So people get frightened and people start reporting them everywhere and think there are far more of them than there are. And so he sends this light cohorts, mounted squadrons, and without being informed of their destination were hurried at full speed. They managed to find, through intelligence that's probably to do with the diplomatic activity with local leaders and with hiring local guides, they find out where Tacfarinas is camped, and they attack at dawn, kill Tacfarinas, capture his son, and disperse his followers. Seems to be a winter action. It's one of those cases where Tacfarinas has had to stop for a while to support and feed his people, and also to gather his plunder, so is vulnerable. The Romans can find him, the Romans can attack him. So you have all the different stages within a major war of raids on both sides, of pursuit on both sides, but it gives you an idea of how this can expand into a big war and then apparently contract into lots of smaller engagements, but how they're related, and how each side tries to outwit the other. And also how the Roman army can adapt to fighting in this way. This isn't necessarily a type of combat, a type of fighting that we think would favour the Romans, but actually they can become pretty good at it, because they do have significant advantages. And again, when we have mention of, it's often translated as light units or light infantry or light cavalry, the word is usually expedita or expediti, which just means without baggage, with the minimum of kit, but not necessarily without armour, not necessarily trained to fight in dispersed order or anything like that, just ordinary troops that adapt to the situation as required. So there's always a problem. You have things that people will want to steal, you have villas that are rich, you have towns and villages that are rich, you have people. All of these things have value and will attract anyone who will attack and steal them if they think they can get away with it. And this is the pattern of the ancient world. It comes back to this raiding as seen as a natural thing. You don't really need a good reason to do it. You don't have to hate the people involved. You just have to think that actually you can get away with this. They are vulnerable. So that you have problems, and there are areas that it's very hard to defend. Again, the Roman army is simply not big enough to spread itself out and defend everything in full strength. And yes, you can build a wall like Hadrian's Wall in that narrow strip of land, relatively narrow, between either coast of northern Britain, and similarly the Antonine Wall. You can build the Limes stockade on the German frontier, again, or you can use a river. You can have these barriers that are whether natural or created, but again, manning them all the time in sufficient strength is a very difficult task, and the army will have other requirements and troops will be sent away. There is a pattern that you find again and again where rumours or accurate information that much of the Roman provincial garrison has gone elsewhere encourages people to think, well, now it's a good time to attack. So again, it comes back to this, the impression of vulnerability invites attack. But on the whole, most of these raiders are not there to fight a full-scale war. They're not there to fight a full-scale siege. A Roman army like Cicero's might decide to spend best part of 2 months besieging a relatively small walled mountain village because they want to make the point that this is what the Romans will do if you upset them. And it's a good way of trying to intimidate the tribes, think, well, you are not out of reach of Rome. And of course, the siegecraft of the Roman army in the late Republican imperial period is very impressive and very scary if you are one of these tribal peoples. They can get to where you live and they can take you out in the same way that they can go when they choose to a fortress like Masada, and they can support themselves in the very harsh conditions of the desert by the Dead Sea until they finish that ramp, until they are in a position to capture the fortress. So let's look at a case where a group of barbarians in the 4th century, according to Ammianus, do try attacking a Roman army in winter quarters. And this is when the Emperor Julian is attacked by a host of enemy attacked, fired with increased hope of taking the town, full of confidence because they'd learned from the statements of deserters that 2 Roman units were absent, billeted elsewhere to make it easier to supply them. So again, it's that sense, the Romans are vulnerable, therefore it's worth a go. Let's attack them. Julian defends the town, but there's no direct attack. They're not ready for an assault. When they get there, they realize the Romans and the walls of the town are a bit stronger than they expected. No one's giving in to them. The threat wasn't enough to blackmail people into giving you money, giving you cattle, giving you whatever you wanted. For a month they hang around, but then they withdraw, crestfallen, muttering they've been silly and foolish to have contemplated the blockade of a city. We come back to the idea of the Roman army that is in many areas spread around frontier areas. It might be along communication routes, it might be in significant positions, but it's there. It can't be concentrated as a field army all the time because you couldn't concentrate in enough places. It is spread fairly thinly, and it's got its outposts, it's got its watchtowers, it's got its garrisons, maybe it's got its rivers, its frontier lines like Hadrian's Wall. But unless there are people there manning them, those fortifications don't matter. Because after all, if Hadrian's Wall is virtually abandoned, then you can go and you can capture a mile castle and you can go through the gateways and head on south. You might have some trouble crossing the Vallum, but even so, if nobody's there to stop you, you've got the time to either build yourself a quick ramp down one side and up the other, or to manhandle or to haul down animals, even your plunder coming back. Defense of frontier systems relies on the manpower of the army, and a manpower that's mobile. It isn't simply about, you can't just wall off everything that you think is valuable and stay behind those walls and hope for the best. That does become something like the policy in later antiquity, and it's something reflected in Vegetius, but that's where you don't have sufficient numbers of troops available all the time to go and confront the enemy in the open in the way that you would before. When, as with Tacfarinas, on at least 2 occasions, Roman garrisons are attacked, presumably by larger forces of Numidians, and in each case the garrison comes out from behind its ramparts and fights in the open. Once, very badly, it runs away, but the second time it hammers the barbarians. So you've changed that emphasis from a mobile army that always wants to fight in the open, always wants to fight pitched battle if it can. But again, it requires the troops to be there, and it requires them to be in a reasonable state of training, a reasonable state of health, their equipment in good condition, and reasonably well led. And it requires, most of the frontier systems make more sense if you look at them as tripwires. They're intended to spot any enemy coming in, send messages, and then gather troops. They are not places where the army is actually planning to fight the enemy. And if they do have to fight them there, it's usually a sign that things have gone wrong, or it might be a way to delay them. So this is a very longer talk than I'd planned, but it's always been the way. This is a topic that I've always found interesting because I think it's something that isn't systematically studied. And I think once you've thought about the mechanics of raiding and how it all works, then a lot of things make more sense. And that's true of Roman frontiers, but it's also true of Iron Age fortifications, ramparts, hill forts and the like. And the little defences around a village. Again, it comes back to just what is the threat you feel you're facing. Sometimes we go back into this sort of very Clausewitzian sense where everything is to do with a major war between organised armies, organised states. And even people who will emphasise how other societies are different sometimes fall into that trap. They don't think enough about how warfare can change, how warfare can be conducted in very different ways. Because again, if it's just a few people coming at night to steal your cattle, then the little rampart around a family farm is something of an obstacle. And it can help you and your sons and your household and your family defend those animals. If you've got people out there giving warning, you've got time to go and hide somewhere. And hill forts, again, very few have been excavated on a sufficient scale to tell how densely occupied they are, whether some of them are as crowded really as some of the Oppida in Gaul, where you have, clearly developed permanent housing that's occupied for a long time, industrial activity, craftsmen, all this sort of thing as well. Maybe we have that in some sites in Britain, maybe not. Maybe some people live there some of the time and others use them as a place of refuge. Because again, you think about it and think, oh, well, yes, you could take this if you've got a major army, but is any enemy that's likely to turn up going to have a major army, and how often? Are you dealing more with a band of raiders who, if you do retire behind your walls and you've driven your sheep and cattle up there, then maybe they'll look and think, no, we didn't catch them, it's not worth risking an assault which might get some of us killed, whether or not it succeeds, then let's just go somewhere else, try and find and surprise somebody next time. And at the very least, you can go away with the consolation, well, they were so scared of us, they went and hid behind their ramparts. So that shows that we, of whatever tribe we happen to be, or the warband of this particular leader, are the toughest, hardest people around, and therefore people are frightened of us. So that's good for our reputation, that people flee when we arrive. They don't come out and fight because they're too scared. So you have to think of a different sort of language of how people interact, of how they think about threats, what those threats are, how they respond to them. And all of this helps you to come in a much more nuanced way when you look at Roman frontiers and you look at all these other aspects as well. So I hope this rather detailed look at something a little bit different, something a little bit unusual has been of interest. I talk about this to some extent. There's a section of one of the chapters in Pax Romana where I use some of this material to go through how a raid works, but much more briefly than this. This was trying to show there is more evidence out there. You could have gathered more, but this is a substantial part of it that gives enough to give an idea that there is why I'm making these claims, why I'm interpreting things in this particular way. So anyway, I hope this has been of interest.